Hello everybody, welcome back to another stream. I hope you're doing well. So yesterday we watched a couple videos, with the first being We Consume Fiction Wrong by Daryl Talks Games. We spent a lot longer on that than I expected, which was perfectly fine. Then we transitioned on over into the art of overanalyzing movies, then back into some Elden Ring lore with my airing of grievances with Elden Ring lore by Garrulous Goldmask, and then we finished off with Is the Golden Order a Functioning Government by Jake Light. So I'm going to start removing the videos from my queue that I've already watched because I screwed up the order a couple days ago. And then for today, we have first on the list, Abandonware Should Be Public Domain by Mild Conviction. Then I thought we could watch Elden Ring, Explain It Like I'm Five by Zahanjo. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. And then, depending on our time, I have a Crucible Knight analysis, The Strongest Warrior in Elden Ring, and or the Rarest Enemy in Elden Ring lore by Zeostorm. I actually don't know if it's Zeostorm or Ziostorm now that I think about it. But anyway, so that's kind of what I have queued up for tonight. So we should have a fun-filled evening ahead of us. Or whatever your time zone is. Scallies, how's it going? Did you make popcorn? No. Nope. I don't like to have like all the seed kernels in my mouth while I'm streaming and whatnot. Can and will give his opinions. Was somebody saying that I couldn't, Mortis? Vice, nice to see you again. Vacuozella, nice to see you. You started another run of DS2 already? My condolences. Mr. Yada, welcome back in. You took a look at Rayo Lucaria, and there are indeed two crystal crabs? Uh-oh. So you'll be taking that Lore Master crown? Thank you. Alright. One crab gives the Twin Sage's head, and the other gives Lazuli head. So, I mean, I couldn't remember if there were just two glintstone crabs, or one being, like, extra glintstone-y and not, but that's perfectly fine. I should tap into the ASMR market and loudly drink things into the mic while watching vids. No, I hate it. That's why I pretty much constantly mute myself while I watch the videos, so I could drink or like clear my throat, do all this nasty stuff out of your ears. No, no, no pleases. All right. So let's go ahead and move into our first video of the night with Abandonware Should Be Public Domain by Mild Conviction. And then, as usual, let me know how the volume is for you guys.
Recently, Warner Bros. Came under heavy fire from consumers because it was announced that the film Coyote vs. Acme, a combined live-action and animated comedy featuring Wile E. Coyote, Will Arnett, and John Cena, was going to be unceremoniously locked in the WB vault despite being totally finished. Reason being, the bean counters over at
Wait. Is that real? I want to like back up and pay more attention. Not that I like wasn't
heavy fire from consumers because it was announced that the film Coyote vs. Acme, a combined live-action and animated comedy featuring Wile E. Coyote, Will Arnett, and John Cena, was going to be unceremoniously locked in the WB vault despite being totally finished.
That's wild. I've heard of stuff like this happening throughout the years. I don't know the full outcome of the story, so I might be like jumping ahead of myself a little bit. I remember seeing a picture of it, or like a screen cap, a couple months back, and it just kind of gave me pretty big Who Framed Roger Rabbit vibes, and I was actually kind of excited about this movie in like a nostalgic kind of way. So it would definitely be a crying shame if they did lock it away. It's real. He did it to Batgirl. David Zaslav did this to a lot of WB projects. So is this movie not coming out anymore? Or was this just like a topic? I guess like the video will probably explain it a bit more.
Reason being, the bean counters over at WB decided that the movie was
It's actually canned and locked away. Oh no, man, that sucks. All right, so yeah, okay. I agree with the premise of this video already. Abandonware should be public domain. Give me that movie for free. No, but not really. But let's go keep on watching.
Likely to break even, and thus the suits at the top made the call to trash it so it can be deemed a tax write-off. Obviously, this seems like a complete and utter waste of effort, especially the effort of people involved in its creation who might have been hopeful of the film's release. It's also wasteful of the anticipation of Looney Tunes fans. No matter how you slice it, it just comes off as ruthlessly pragmatic corporate penny pinching. And what really makes this confusing is that, apparently, test screenings of the film had very positive reactions. Combining that with the sheer power of the Looney Tunes name, it seems doubtful the movie would be that much of a bomb.
Yeah, I mean, I could just imagine that this would probably get a sizable audience, but again, I'm not freaking marketing for WB, so what the hell do I know? I'm just as a consumer, I'm a bit sad to hear all this, because I was kind of excited about it. So yeah. Hey Stella, welcome back to the stream. Zaslav is like exhibit 1 on why people who actually like movies should run studios. Well, the thing is, money.
If one at all. Thankfully, the public backlash to this decision has led to WB instead shopping around for other distributors to sell the movie to. Worst of all, this isn't even the first time this happened. Warner Brothers also apathetically tossed away Batgirl, which was also completely finished, and Scooby-Doo and the Haunted High-Rise. Is it possible these films...
I mean, I'll be honest with you guys, I'm not really surprised about Batgirl because it's one of those titles that is not going to have a lot of mainstream appeal for a variety of reasons that I don't really feel like getting into. Sorry, Mortis. But the Scooby-Doo one in particular is surprising to me because the other Scooby-Doo movies have been huge. It's just such a large franchise that it kind of boggles my mind to learn all this, to be honest. Hey, howdy, welcome into stream again. You were interested in Batgirl after it got canned, it's all good.
Films would have indeed failed to break even. Sure, but that doesn't change how ridiculously inefficient this makes WB look. Even if it was a smart call financially, they shouldn't have let themselves reach the point where they were canceling fully completed movies in the first place. And that's not even addressing the sheer fact that, as consumers, none of us have to be sympathetic to the finances of a corporation that saw $34 billion in revenue in 2022.
To be fair, revenue is different than profit, and for all we know, their expenses could have been $35 billion. I mean, I don't actually think that's what the numbers really are, but this is something that can be slightly misleading.
But that's starting to get off topic a bit. The reason I bring this all up is because it got me thinking. Why are companies allowed to basically discard their work or pretend it isn't theirs, while also locking it out of reach from consumers? That seems like the result that negatively affects the most people. Even in the case of WB, where they might get a reimbursement for these movies in the form of a tax write-off, that doesn't change the fact that time and manpower were put into the film to begin with.
So this is one of those issues where copyright law is simultaneously good and bad. And I think with this example specifically, it's kind of a little bit cherry-picked because it's really easy to play up on the this is a complete project. All they had to do was release it, but they didn't. But unfortunately, the law doesn't really understand the nuances to that degree. And the whole idea of copyright protection is to protect somebody's intellectual property. And if you have an idea of something, let's use Mickey Mouse, because that just recently became public domain, the rubber hose style of Mickey Mouse, Steamboat Willie. And you're Disney, that character is your intellectual property, and you don't necessarily want any Joe taking that design and slapping it on their products to market their products, because what can happen and has happened in the past is that those products might be garbage or actively harmful to the consumers. And what can happen is that consumers can start associating Mickey Mouse with these kind of garbage products and then associate Mickey Mouse with garbage, and it would actually harm the standing and status of Disney and their holdings in Mickey Mouse. So there's a lot of good reasons why copyright protections should exist, but overall, I do think it's a very draconian system that is in desperate need of updating. And I don't necessarily know how I feel about the whole Wile E. Coyote versus Acme or Batgirl conundrums in relation to this, because I feel like these are kind of two different arguments. And I wouldn't necessarily call those abandonware, but I'm also curious to see where what's his name again? Malicious intent? Mild conviction. Two completely different ideas there. So I'm really curious to see where mild conviction is going to spin things. Stella says, counterpoint on the Batgirl thing, Sony still made Morbius and Madam Web comes out in a couple weeks, and outside comic book people who knew who they were to begin with, I don't know if that's a good counterpoint. Like, they got released, but so is your counterpoint that Morbius should have never been released? Because if so, fair, valid, I don't know. So Howdy said, for your evil thing, you thought it's a phrase that could be really important to the story if you go along with it. And it's anger to be Elxis is to be evil, and evil is to live. Sorry, my man, I don't have like enough context to feel the weight of that statement, and I'm also kind of in a streamer brain mode. Hey Chadwick, how's it going? Are we about to have a wild discussion on IP law? Maybe. IP freely, I don't know. Ownership laws are sticky widgets. You really want them, even if they can be onerous. Exactly. Stellas was saying, it was the thing about shelving it when it has less mainstream appeal anyway. Yeah, I don't know. Is it better for them to have like shelved Morbius, or better to have shelved Wile E. Coyote, or like Scooby Doo? That's kind of like they're free to do with it what they want, because unfortunately they have the rights, and we don't just arbitrarily strip rights away from people and or corporations, for better and worse at times. Then we get Shrek using all the Disney characters that were in public domain as a middle finger. Well, I mean, if they're public domain, that's definitely how one can extend the middle finger. And to be fair, like, Disney did some scummy stuff with taking public domain works to begin with and just kind of like retelling them in their own Disney way. So it's plagiarism all the way down.
Time and manpower that could have gone to a project that got an official release. That's tens or even hundreds of thousands of total work hours they get to pretend never happened. If they want to throw it all away, then they might as well toss it to the public, where the final product can at least have a chance to reach the eyes and ears of people who might appreciate it. This situation reminded me of something else: the history of video games and software in general, and how it's rife with projects that are also tossed away. And they are aptly called abandonware. Granted,
yeah, and I think one of the issues that's kind of hard for me to reconcile with the Wile E. Coyote movie and Scooby-Doo is that I have no idea how this tax code works for these corporations to be able to make, let's just say, recoup their losses or take advantage of it in such a way that they were intended to be losses to begin with, so that way they could get more money in the long run based on how draconian the codes are. And I think that's a little bit of a different issue than abandonware. So yeah, I'm curious where we're going with this.
abandonware isn't the exact same as the Coyote versus Acme situation. Abandonware is typically released officially before slowly losing revenue and ultimately being ignored by its publisher or owner. I've talked about abandonware before. dating all the way back to my 3-year-old video on the importance of piracy. But for the sake of convenience, I'll go over it again here, since it is the main topic of the video. Publishers and copyright owners no longer care about their abandoned product because it's no longer making them any money. And why aren't these games making any money? Well, there's no physical copies being printed to put on store shelves anymore, and they have not been ported to modern platforms. So no current-day digital storefront even sells them. Not Steam, not GOG, not PlayStation Store, Xbox Live, or Nintendo eShop. They're nowhere. If you want them, your only choices are buying a second-hand copy, which may be more expensive than you think thanks to the terrible used game economy and how insanely overpriced some classics are.
And this is kind of an issue that I ran into trying to stream Alundra for you guys. Fortunately, I had already had the PS TV and whatnot, but if I didn't have that, or the PS TV wasn't available, or the PS TV shop didn't work, which it kind of almost doesn't, I would have needed to have hunted down either a PS3 and done the same thing that I did, or I would need to literally go back and find a working PS1 as well as an actual disc of Alundra and stream it that way. And I think a lot of this stuff is just absolutely ridiculous in that technically it's not about the physical medium to an extent. It's sort of like the digital license that isn't necessarily digital. So let me try to rephrase this because that was just terrible. So like when you have a game, technically the thing that allows you to quote unquote play the game is this made up license that exists between the company and the consumer. So you need to be licensed to play these games, essentially, which doesn't make a lick of sense to me because it's not like you have an individual contract with a company when you're buying like the physical medium of a game that you can't just copy it and do with it what you wish. I mean, there's been like some court decisions which have said like consumers can digitally back up their own files and whatnot. And of course, that opens up its own can of worms of talking about lending other people copies of the thing that you may physically own versus like the digital backup of that thing you may have owned. And over time, one thing that kind of blew my mind is that the actual physical media will begin to fail due to the the nature of the electronics within them. Like, I'm struggling to find the words, but like not like the transistors or like the diodes, but anyway, the actual like circuits embedded into like the old cartridges will cease to be able to function properly as a byproduct of the way that they were manufactured. Like it's just a factor of aging. It's not like planned obsolescence. Don't get me wrong there. And then after a long enough period of time, CDs and those kind of discs will be unreadable to other devices for kind of similar reasons, which I don't like fully understand, but I mean, the principle is there. So what are you supposed to do with games that like break on you? Like if your console like scratches up your disc, did you still not purchase that product? Do you still not have that license? What's to stop you from going online and downloading a copy of the game that you bought? And how is that so much different than having the foresight to digitally back up your own copy? I mean, there's a lot of this stuff which just kind of like pisses me off and doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think the whole licensing agreements is just absolute bullshit because, I mean, who's going to stop you if you play a game without a license? Like, this isn't enforceable by law in my eyes. Like, it's different than driving a car where you're going to have a cop roll into your house and be like, hey, you got a license for that TV? Well, bad news if you're in Britain, but not so much in the US, you know? So anyway, capacitor leak. Thank you, Chadwick. Yeah, Jesse says Suikoden 1 and 2 are like $100 for a copy nowadays. Honestly, that's not too bad because it used to be over $200 a copy just for Suikoden 2. So I think your data is a little bit out of date. Just emulate? Well, technically, depending on the type of emulation you do, it can be illegal. Nintendo's still charging full price for decades old games is wild. I mean, it's kind of the nature of the market, though. Like, who's going to stop them if it's on their own platform? Give you Metal Gear Solid 4, not the fifth version of 3, not a third version of 1. I feel that. Yeah, digital storage denigrates pretty quickly. I don't think denigrate. You might mean like disintegrate or something. Degrades, probably. That's probably the word. You had to play a game you own a physical copy of off of a ROM because you got a bad cartridge, and sometimes stuff like that happens. If you accidentally destroy a book you bought, are you owed a digital backup? That's a good question, but I mean, um, I personally do not see an issue with that. Like, ideally, if you got a book and you bought like the actual paperback version, I think it'd be super freaking cool if you were also given access to a digital version. I think there's something like that with it might have been like Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh cards where whenever you got a booster pack, you're able to kind of like upload that onto like their proprietary game code thing so you can like play the online version of the cards that you physically bought. But I mean that's just kind of like going beyond the point. But generally I tend to be pretty um lenient with the whole idea of like intellectual property rights because if you buy a book, I mean, I don't see the issue of like being able to go online and get like a digital copy of the book that you purchased. Or to be fair, you could just go to the library. I mean, should libraries be illegal because you're kind of renting and borrowing, and in a sort of sense like copying works, especially like when libraries offer digital downloads with restricted access periods. There's a lot of questions that come up with that. And yeah, one of the other things which Shadow kind of brings up is the whole issue of first party purchasers versus like secondhand market purchasers. And yeah, it just there's a lot that goes into that. Hey Captini and Global Sequence, welcome back to stream. Your Diablo CD for PS1 does not work anymore. It used to work a few years ago still. Vinyl records do that a lot, come with a digital download code. Yeah, that's a good parallel right there. We could reconfigure IP law to archive digital goods. They're inherently infinitely reproducible. We're moving into a new future pretty soon. I doubt that because the biggest issue of moving into that so-called new future is having uh, competent legislators. Sorry, maybe we should say this a different way. Legislators competent enough with technology to write laws in such a way that would be good. And there's a lot of work to be done on that front in getting more technically literate legislators, not just in the U.S. but worldwide. And then even if you did technically have more technologically literate legislators, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to revise and adapt old laws and apply them in new foundational ways, because quite often laws aren't just revised and or cannot be revised without a lot of setup to be able to do so. So unless like there's court cases that involve those laws or a really big push to change those laws, they're just kind of set there until there's a big enough catalyst to enact change. Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't just the Thor pirate software guy. I think what's his name? Gabe Newell said that as well. It's usually a case of economics and convenience. And that quote might predate him as well. So yeah. Basically, if it's extremely convenient to get something legally and you give people the option to do it, they're more likely to do it. But when things become inconvenient, they're more likely to pirate and kind of justify their beliefs after the fact.
Or piracy. That's it. You might think that there's not that many abandoned games. After all, the medium has only existed for about 50 years. So how many are there? 5,000? 10,000? Maybe even 15,000? Well, according to the homepage of myabandonware.com, a site dedicated to hosting abandoned games between 1977 and 2012, there's over 26,000 games tossed aside by publishers.
And that doesn't really surprise me because a lot of these things are like literal shovelware. And so the most well-known example of a game that I would call shovelware would be E.T. on the Atari. But setting that aside, you do have some extremely old games that just were pretty bad. And their companies just don't really care about them anymore because it's probably not worth the hassle of porting them into the more modern marketplace and honestly expecting to be able to get money from it. And then setting all that stuff aside, one huge issue in trying to reinvigorate dead projects is all of the licensing agreements which comes along with it. So to give a bit of a more modern example of how that works and kind of doesn't work, I think we could look at the games like all of the Rockstar or Guitar Hero games. If you look at the set list of songs in Guitar Hero 1 and Guitar Hero 2, you'd notice that most of the songs from Guitar Hero 1 don't make it onto Guitar Hero 2, and you could apply the same kind of formula to Guitar Hero 3 because it takes a lot of licensing to get those tracks to port them into those games. So of course not every single game ever used like super famous licensed music and all that stuff, but the issue gets compounded when you have to take into consideration international copyright law and the licensing agreements for other countries, and this has influenced other games as well. I know there's like a really modern version of this which I can't think of. Hold on, there's like an anime. Oh yeah, one of the animes used to have Paranoid Android as the closing credits for one of their seasons. I don't remember which one it was. I never watched the anime. Just this is something that I've heard about. And then they got rid of it for like their DVD release or something like that because they didn't have the rights to keep using the song that way. And so that's like one of the weirder type legacy things of licensing agreements, and that extends beyond games a little bit. But Abandonware isn't necessarily limited to games based off of what was the name? Mild Conviction. Okay, I was almost like mild inconvenience, mild conviction. So as he was bringing up a moment ago with the whole aspect of abandoned movies, I think there is a bit of a through line between all of these things right here. Yeah, and Estella says, as far as the video games are concerned, there's a lot of old games that only exist still due to piracy. Honestly, Earthbound Zero or Mother One, that there is literally only ever one copy of that game made in English, and the person who bought the copy just allowed people to back it up for him digitally, and because of that action, a lot of fans in the West got to play Earthbound Zero slash Mother on their own for the first time, and that put enough pressure on Nintendo to release it on their Wii store, the Wii U store. I don't remember which one, but still no Mother 3. So rip to the dream. But yeah, it like piracy isn't necessarily entirely bad, but it certainly is frustrating that the only way to play Mother 3 is to get a Japanese cartridge and then try to figure out how to mod it yourself, which has its own issues with companies that had their say in it.
And before you make any assumptions, not all of these games are no-name titles. The library of deserted works includes stuff like Need.
Oh yeah, yeah. So the other thing, and I apologize for pausing so much. The other thing that I wanted to mention with the whole abandonware aspect is that sometimes the companies that originally made these games don't exist anymore. Because I played Alundra on stream a couple days ago, um, that's like one thing, but the company Working Designs who like translated the game, they don't exist anymore. So in a certain sense, is Alundra abandonware? I have no idea. Like I honestly wonder where the royalties of my purchase went. My purchase of five whole American dollars. Um, went maybe like the Japanese developer and stuff like that. So there's other ways that games can be abandoned beyond just like the devs not caring about them. Hey Jay Dixon, welcome back to stream. Nice to see you again.
Titles. The library of deserted works includes stuff like Need for Speed 2, Underground 2, Hot Pursuit 2, and the original Most Wanted. It also has Silent Hill 2, Silent Hill 3, and Silent Hill 4, Oregon Trail, Black and White, Civilization, The Incredible Machine, House of the Dead, Typing of the Dead, MechWarrior 4, Zoo Tycoon, Command and Conquer, Manhunt 2, and even several Yu-Gi-Oh games. These are not random shovelware garbage. Some of them were huge hits from a decade ago or more. Now, because these games are abandonware, they are relatively safe to redistribute publicly like they are through myabandonware.com. That much is certain, and it's definitely one upside to the situation. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, that's the most you can get away with. The fact that these games are considered abandoned doesn't give everyone free rein to just do what they please with them. You see, there are several types or circumstances of abandonware, and some of them are very easy to work with and have minimal risk of intervention by an owner. For example, freeware or open source programs or code that has been abandoned, or orphaned code whose owner is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to identify or contact, or programs that were owned by a company that no longer exists. In these situations, abandonware can be shared pretty openly, and it's highly unlikely anyone will make any effort to stop it. In fact, you could even go so far as to modify it and maybe even remake it with the same name and everything, and you might still be left alone. However, there are other types of abandonware that do carry some or even significant risk, especially if you try to actively redistribute the software. Specifically, games that are owned by a company that still does exist, but they simply ended support and turned the other cheek away from those who share.
And I wish mild conviction went into a little bit more detail on what he is defining as abandonware, because I think there's a difference between IPs actually being abandoned or companies like dissolving, and therefore like these artifacts of those companies exist in this weird legal limbo where technically there can be no real ownership of it because the owner doesn't exist anymore, versus just let's just call it inactiveware. So before Nintendo and Game Freak like re-released Pokemon Red and Blue on like the 3DS digital platform, like you could only have originally played them with the red and blue carts, which I think is a bit different than a company that doesn't exist anymore, like Working Designs and how they had published Alundra here in the West. So, hey Reese, welcome into the stream. Nice to see you. Hope you're doing well, man. If online shops didn't exist anyway, more games would have stopped being sold. True. Chadwick says, if the company has no interest in juicing a property, we can't force them to do anything. Yes, that is exactly correct. Just because a company isn't selling you something doesn't give you the right to access that something, which kind of makes a lot of sense and is very similar to property laws in some ways, where if your land has like a cool little, I don't know, pond in it that doesn't give your neighbors the right to trespass into your land and jump in the pond and make use of it, even if you aren't actively in the pond yourself, just to kind of give a crude example.
They don't condone it, but they don't try to stop it either, because it's just not worth the effort. But the fact of the matter is, they can stop it whenever they wish. This is where a huge chunk of video game abandonware sits, especially the popular titles I listed earlier, and it's why no one really tries to redistribute the games in a more official or robust capacity. If they attempt it, the company who owns the IP might suddenly step in and throw their weight around, even though they didn't care about the product until now. It's very frustrating, and it keeps these old classics locked to a level of obscurity they don't deserve to be confined to. This is where the public domain would help. For anyone who has heard the term before but isn't exactly sure what it is, I'll give a brief rundown. The public domain is the total collection of all creative works that are no longer under the protection of exclusive intellectual property rights. These rights could have either expired, been willfully given up, waived by some sort of contract, or just otherwise rendered no longer applicable. For example, the works of Leonardo da Vinci are all in the public domain because he was long dead before copyright even became a thing. And more recently, Winnie the Pooh entered the public domain simply because copyright on the character expired. It's why that terrible horror movie was allowed to release. Basically, when something enters the public domain, anyone can use it for anything, including monetizing it. It's completely no holds barred. If abandonware video games were allowed to enter the public domain the moment the publisher decided to stop support, they would at least have a chance to continue living on through derived works created by others, openly and passionately shared among fans and hosted on any file-sharing site or sold on any storefront. And they wouldn't have to be fearful of any litigation. That sounds like it would be a pretty good time. But the question is, why aren't these abandoned games on the public domain? Well, the answer was more or less already given a minute ago. Just because they're abandoned doesn't mean their copyright protections have expired. So when will they expire? Sadly, this is where the conversation becomes rather irritating and requires some context, specifically surrounding America's copyright law history. So let's start at the very beginning, in the year 1790, which is when the...
And to be fair, I think talking about the copyright stuff is going to be a bit more American-centric. If somebody went to a country that did not have a lot of copyright protection laws, I think where was the Pirate Bay originally based out of? Was it Sweden? Maybe Sweden isn't the best example, but if you go to another country, maybe I'm speaking out of my ass here, but maybe like Malaysia, their laws might be different, and you could essentially run a black market third party selling app, taking everybody's intellectual property rights and passing it off as your own kind of storefront and just undercutting the market. That could potentially be legal there, and the only really concern would be if you have like some international agreements between the countries to prosecute people across borders for stuff like that. So anyway, setting all that stuff aside, I just want to mention that this is more of like an American-centric problem. You're with you, comrade, but it's all about the money, yeah. Many games are essentially abandoned, except for the fact that putting one spot in the online store costs almost nothing. I mean, that's kind of a slippery slope argument to make, because just because something is inactive, that doesn't mean that their control over that property needs to go away. And there could be any number of reasons for it. whether or not they had plans to release something again, but it didn't work for whatever reason. It's still within their intellectual property, and they should still be able to control it how they want to a degree. But I do think having the whole like 75-year thing is a bit much, and I do wish these laws were revised or a little bit less draconian. I don't know.
The first Federal Copyright Act was instituted. It allowed creative works to be protected for 14 years, with the option of one renewal for an additional 14 years after that, adding up to 28 years total. The next Copyright Act was in 1831, which made the initial copyright term 28 years now, with an option for a 14-year renewal on top of that, making the new total 42 years. The next major Copyright Act was in 1909, which changed the renewal length from 14 years to 28 as well, so the new total was 56 years. The next big Copyright Act after that was in 1976, which changed the copyright term to a static 75-year length. In the case of creative works made by a single or small group of collaborating authors, however, the copyright term was until the death of the author or the last living author, plus 50 more years after that. As you can see, copyright term length has been historically pretty meaningless, because every time major companies realize the end of their copyright protection is just around the corner, they lobby to have it extended, and also to ensure that their future works are protected for longer. But the most egregious Copyright Act was the most recent one, in 1998. It was derogatorily called the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, because the Walt Disney Company realized their ownership of the Steamboat Willie version of Mickey Mouse was coming to an end in 2003, and they fought tooth and nail to prevent that from happening. To gather up favor, Disney CEO at the time, Michael Eisner, and other executives contributed $94,054 to Democratic members of Congress and $62,932 to Republican members of Congress.
Man, how cheap is that to have like 150 grand buy you the rights to just print money off of Mickey Mouse? Obviously, having the rights to Mickey Mouse is an incredible boon to begin with and a great starting point, but holy crap, is buying your local senator cheap. And now it's public domain, yeah, 2024. So I mean, that's still 23 years, or no, 21 years. You said 2003. 21 years of, making sure that weird ass Disney Mickey Mouse horror game didn't exist is probably chump change to Disney. Exclusivity is kind of where they're just kind of building their brand off of. So it makes a lot of sense for them to want to protect it. But holy crap, that's just kind of pennies to Disney, isn't it? Clementown made a great video related to this, how cheap it is to buy politicians. Yeah, but it just surprises me that it was that cheap for Disney for this specific thing. I know other topics which don't have like a lot of pushback is like ridiculously surprisingly cheap to lobby for certain laws, but anyway. Captini wonders how things like Lovecraft's IP works. There's a huge amount of stories based on that mythos not done by him. So you can have derivative works. I think one of the issues with Lovecraft was that he died before his books and short stories ever got popular. And so I don't know how much his estate controlled that stuff, but it seems pretty lackadaisical. And then the other thing about like the whole authorship is that even if Lovecraft died, a lot of things could depend on the publisher, and they could have like given their okay. And I don't know the particulars of that, so that's kind of a good question. It's funny that U.S. IP law is so restrictive. Colonial Americas with rife with literary piracy. I mean, that's probably why. Um, they wanted, because like the US is so entrepreneurial, over the time once we started to industrialize a lot more, the whole idea of branding became a bigger part of American culture, and that just kind of goes hand in hand with copywriting in my mind. There might be a lot more to that story that I don't know though.
Adjusting for inflation, that's about $180,000 and $120,000 today, respectively. Obviously, the act passed, and now Disney properties, along with every piece of media created by corporate authorship since 1964, was under copyright for 95 years, all because Disney wanted to maintain an iron grip around their mouse, and all it cost them was a handful of chump change. The first commercial video game console was the Magnavox Odyssey, which launched in September 1972. That means that any of its games that aren't already placed in the public domain manually won't be there until at least 2067. I genuinely do not know if I'll live long enough to see that. And I wasn't even born until almost 20 years after the Odyssey's release anyway. 95 years is a long time. It's long enough to ensure that most fans of any given game will be long dead before they see it added to the public domain. Not only that, but it's also more than long enough for the company who owned it to dissolve and cease to exist anyway, meaning they likely can't officially release the game into public domain themselves. If you don't own the copyright to something abandoned, then you cannot claim that it is abandoned, no matter how obvious it is. And you can't start making money off your own modified version as if it were in the public domain, because even if the copyright owner technically doesn't exist anymore, you can still get in big legal trouble. This is the part where piracy.
I'm curious as to where that legal trouble would come from, because you would need the plaintiff to do it, and this seems more like a civil issue than a criminal one, so it's not like you'd have a district attorney prosecute you for this kind of thing. So it's kind of like this legal gray area where um your parents' eyes are closed, or like your parents are out of the house so you can throw a party and nobody's gonna like be the wiser, I guess. So anyway, Fidlin, welcome into the stream. Nice to see you.
Comes in. It's how people get their hands on games that will never see the light of day for any number of unfortunate reasons, usually licensing issues. I absolutely condone piracy for games that aren't being sold in stores or on digital storefronts anymore. Because if you don't pirate them, then buying secondhand copies is the only alternative. But there's fewer of those each day.
And one of the things that's always bothered me about the whole, like, you need to physically own or purchase the medium that you want to, consume, is that it doesn't make sense to me to buy secondhand. Like, where is that a license agreement coming from? How does the original owner of the IP benefit? They don't. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me for a variety of reasons, but I don't know, I digress.
The remaining ones might get more and more expensive. But sadly, even piracy doesn't address every problem. One of the biggest misconceptions about PC gaming is that no matter how old a game is, it'll still run on your current rig no problem. But that's simply not true. Some games are so old they have no idea how to read your modern day hardware. For a game released in 1994, your RTX 4090 might as well be alien technology not of this earth.
Damn, our chat be popping off with the 4090s. But yeah, just to give a little bit more context on what I meant by the whole like second-hand market thing, it's damn it, what was I gonna say? Oh yeah. So like, if I wanted to buy a CD and listen to a bunch of songs by a band I like, but I don't have the money or I don't want to spend the money to buy a new disc. Functionally, what is the difference to that band between me buying secondhand versus me literally pirating that CD with all of its music? Functionally, it's the same, but legally, it's not.
Thankfully, compatibility is growing thanks to applications like DOSBox or making a virtual machine. But even then, the game might still not run as well as it would on the actual hardware of the time. This compatibility issue doesn't stop at just games either. There are schools, science institutions, and even hospitals out there that are using old computers with vulnerable old operating systems because some extremely critical part of their infrastructure runs on an old program that hasn't been updated in years or even decades.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, and I'm really glad that mild mild conviction brought that up because that's something that I've heard about that I've also seen firsthand to some degree just how dated a lot of these really sophisticated systems really are, and a lot of companies are kind of enforcing the equivalence of ransomware by making monthly charges on these antiquated systems being um, supported by the most current versions of the programs that they're making. So this is kind of like a weird thing. Maybe a good example of this, and this isn't like necessarily related to the hospitals and whatnot, are things like cars nowadays turning off features unless people subscribe to those features. I think there was like an SUV. I don't know if this like actually made it to market or whatnot that had heated seats, but they could only be enabled if somebody like was subscribed to some program that costs like $5.99 a month to have heated seats. That's just kind of absolutely ridiculous. Another one is how like John Deere doesn't allow their farmers contracted to them to do third party maintenance. They make it so that they need to go to the officially licensed John Deere distributors to work on their equipment. And there's a whole lot of other stuff that goes with the right to repair that is kind of beyond my level of knowledge to talk about, beyond like this kind of a cursory stuff right here. So yeah, bringing up the whole thing with like the hospitals and stuff is an excellent thing, and I'm really glad that they brought that up. Point of sale systems are like that too. Yeah, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Just charge a monthly subscription instead. Don't get you started on the digital card features. Yeah. Hey, Mercy, welcome back to stream. Nice to have you again. Chadwick says there's a school system in Michigan somewhere that runs its boiler system on ancient Commodore 64 machines. They just eBay new stuff when they need it. Boy, you wish you could remember where. I think I heard about that. Like, there was a kid who like programmed all of that stuff on his own, and then they started using it, and he left and went to college. But you know, they just kept the system going because it's more work and more money to like do things right a different way, and yeah, it's a real pain in the ass.
I can only imagine how many professional settings around the world are still dependent on Windows XP.
Oh yeah, so Scalazy said nuclear silos supposedly ran on floppy disks because how the hell would anyone know how to attack those? I mean, they have vulnerabilities, but unironically, it does lead to a bit more cybersecurity by having antiquated systems in place like that because there's less points of vulnerability because those types of technologies were more manual in the way that they were implemented. So I can't speak too much about that topic in depth for reasons, but um, yeah, it's probably better that I stop talking about that.
There are still places out there hiring people who know COBOL and Fortran, programming languages made in the 1950s. It's possible to reverse engineer some of this old code and translate it to something modern, but it can cost tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars to achieve that. Much of data preservation in general is a total shit show, and copyright gets in the way. Going back to video games for a moment, I just want to say that as much as I stand by piracy, I must also admit that I would be perfectly fine with legally buying ROMs of my favorite games. I'm talking about the actual 2 megabyte file of Bahamut Lagoon for the SNES. If Square put that on Steam or something for $5, DRM free, just the honest-to-God ROM for everyone to officially have with no legal gray area to worry about, I would buy it. I'd be totally fine with buying ROMs that work with any emulator released directly from the publisher for $5 a pop. And I know plenty of other people would be cool with that too. And then there's online games that get unceremoniously unplugged.
Something about his cadence there just kind of reminded me a lot of Ratatosker. I don't know if you guys can hear it too.
But in some cases, the population isn't even that barren when the time comes to shut everything down, abruptly ruining the investment of hundreds or thousands of playtime hours for hundreds of active players. There are instances where the community takes it upon themselves to continue the game with private servers, and the publisher mercifully turns a blind eye. But they could still step in and put a stop to it whenever they please. Unfortunately, a lot of games cannot run on private community servers.
Yeah, didn't Dark Souls 2 servers literally just go down like last week or something like that? So, rip to the dream.
Because the publisher hoards the source code despite doing nothing with it, or due to the game's infrastructure being too big and expensive for a group of fans to reasonably maintain themselves. It's so crazy when I see a company stomp their feet about piracy of a specific product that they're not even selling anymore. Nintendo is the worst with this. They even went so far as to attempt to get all scans of all Nintendo Power issues taken off of Internet Archive, even though they don't offer any way of reading these issues themselves.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's kind of crazy. It's really funny because I was just talking about like Nintendo Power and Game Informer the other day and was like pulling up images.
If Nintendo had their own public Nintendo Power archive, then the request for removal would at least be understandable. But they don't have any such thing. How far do removal attempts like this have to go before the company is no longer just protecting their trademark and are now just actively destroying their history? None of this
Stella asked, didn't Nintendo or someone have to get a couple games off a piracy site because they didn't have the code for it internally anymore? I don't know if they didn't have the code internally anymore, but I do know for a fact that one of the games that was like offered on the Wii store was taken from somebody's online like backup. It was definitely a ROM that was distributed as a ROM for a certain game. It wasn't like a completely unique backup of that game, so yeah. Yeah, there you go. Yada says Nintendo did sell ROMs that were sourced from a piracy site, which is just absolutely hilarious to me, but I mean, more power to them. Like, if I was in charge of a company like that, I'd probably do something similar just to flex or say, screw you guys. I don't know.
Litigious nonsense would be something to worry about if the abandonment or ending of a product or service meant instant entry into the public domain.
And so I think the pitfall with this argument is something is abandoned until it's not anymore. And for all we know, Nintendo could be working on archiving all this stuff and making this gigantic, grand site in 2026. But that doesn't mean that we should have unfettered access between now and whenever that site is released, which is the real fly in the ointment with copyright law, as they say.
This way, companies would have to choose between putting more effort into keeping a property active themselves or letting the people do it for them at the cost of making money off it. We don't need a 95-year wait for that transfer to happen. So what's the solution to all this? Well, the first point I've already made is to make abandonment an automatic release into public domain. If a company takes a product off shelves, physical and digital, with no intention to put it back up within a certain amount of time, then they've functionally abandoned it, and it should be forked over to the people.
So one issue with this goes into what you could legally define as intention, and there are any number of ways for companies to get around that, which is kind of its own argument that goes a bit beyond the point. So it just comes down to what you can legally define as being abandoned or shelved, and trying to impose limits on companies to offer their products to consumers. And that might be a good idea on paper, but there could be some unintended consequences of that. If you think about the idea of how intellectual property doesn't just affect video games, it affects like actual physical inventions and whatnot. And so if people, maybe this isn't the best argument to make. All right, I'm just going to go ahead with it anyway, because maybe there's like a kernel of truth in there somewhere, and I'm just like not thinking of the best way to talk about it. But if a company makes a physical product and the first iteration of that physical product is harmful or whatnot and is garbage and shouldn't be sold because they've learned from their mistakes and made a second version that's better, just because they refuse to sell that first product, that shouldn't give somebody else the right to come in and take that product and take that name and sell it with all of that information attached to it and make an audience believe that such a product is still representative of the original company's current stock of products that they sell and or advertise. So yeah, okay, thinking about this in another way. So we've all, I mean, not all of us, but speaking generally here, we've all played Elden Ring, right? Well, what if somebody in chat wants to play Elden Ring patch 1.01 rather than 1.00 or 1.3.2 or whatever? Is the Elden Ring that was released in the state of 1.01 technically abandonware because the product got updated? Legally speaking, you might be able to make an argument for that if FromSoft isn't offering that version of the game, but you would need to have these kind of provisions to cover all of these different scenarios, which is a headache of the highest order. And that's just kind of like one of the issues of trying to legislate to begin with, which is why these laws are kind of overbearing and overreaching in their current form, because there's so many edge cases that it's more often better to have too robust laws than laws that are not robust enough. Then again, putting a hasn't used X property in Y years is how we get companies making movies just to keep the property. Is that necessarily like a bad thing? I mean, sure, sort of, maybe, but yeah, that's where you might get like the half-assed Wile E. Coyote thing. Joji Poji, welcome into the stream. You're watching TA at the same damn time? It's kind of a weird mix between the stream and that right now. You would have to argue that they're separate products, maybe. With different versions of a product, that's almost impossible. Yeah, exactly. Which kind of like goes back into the whole like Elden Ring patch thing. I think that's a pretty good example of like how this stuff is a little bit wonky.
The next solution is to shorten copyright terms again. I honestly think 30 years is generous enough. If you release a product that sees active sales for 30 years, you should hopefully be made rich by the time those 30 years are over. If the product
I do not like that kind of argument at all. I feel like that's just kind of disingenuous. It doesn't necessarily have to be about the wealth that one amasses. It's about the brand and your ownership of that. And well, we could make like claims that like 30 years should be enough for somebody to do with their brand as they please. I feel like the whole like having it based on like you should have made enough money is just kind of a that isn't it.
doesn't sell very well despite staying available for the whole term, then what additional harm could releasing it to the public domain possibly do that hasn't happened already? 30 years is more than enough time to milk a product and get the most out of it. Thirdly, and this is the most difficult one by far, I think everyone in general would benefit in the long term if we slowly learned to depend more on open source software and technology, and less on proprietary stuff, especially if usage and maintenance requires increasingly obscure knowledge. I know that's easier said than done, especially when proprietary software is often developed and updated faster thanks to the fact that it's proprietary. But I think as long as we at least address abandonment and long copyright terms, the situation will be significantly better. If you've been following my channel for a while, then you know I have a lot to say about this topic and everything related to it. And I'm sure I'll think of more to say in the future. But for now, this concludes my thoughts on Abandonware.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily disagree that I think moving away from proprietary software and hardware would be a generally good thing. I don't necessarily think that ties directly into abandonware and whatnot, which is perfectly fine to like add to the video, but it just felt a little bit out of place with everything else. So, okay. Nonetheless, that was a pretty good video. I'm going to go ahead and link it into chat for you guys. If you want to give Mild Conviction a like and or a sub, I'm going to open up their channel to see what else they have before I consider EA's history of acquisitions and closures, the fate of physical games and media, RPGs that punish grinding, Elden Ring and open world design, Elden Ring Pinnacle of Souls. Okay, this looks like some interesting stuff for me. I'm going to go ahead and sub to the channel and give this video a like. So, all right. Yeah, and as Mr. Yada says, you see where people are coming from with 30 years, but that's assuming the product was successful from day 1 to the end of year 30. Yeah, that's kind of one of the reasons why I said like the argument that they were presenting felt a bit disingenuous to me. But to be fair, is it arguably good that somebody could mismanage a product or idea that could benefit a lot of people for 30 years and have a stranglehold on that product or idea? Maybe, maybe not. And one of the issues I think that it was not covered so much in this video was the difference in copyright laws between countries and how countries like China will steal like patents from the US and then just build the exact same product or slightly changed your handwriting, like make it look a little bit different than mine, and then sell that product in the US. I think like stuff like that is pretty messed up, and that can't really be very easily navigated as far as like the legal channels go. But of course, like that would be beyond the scope of this video as well, which is more or less focusing on the draconian US copyright laws themselves. Joji loves the content. You've been wondering about lately. Should someone be able to take away IPs from someone who alters the source material, characters, or spirit of the IP? So I think the way that your question is phrased is a little bit misleading. So if we take the premise that somebody has an IP that is built off of altering somebody else's IP, that would mean that they were able to have access or rights to the newly created IP to begin with, which might not be true legally speaking. So if I took Steamboat Willie Mickey Mouse and made a cartoon of that thing in 2022 and called it my own thing, I wouldn't have the legal grounds to do so because I should have never had the rights to Steamboat Willie then. But if I took the design of Steamboat Willie and I exaggerated it and I was using it as a form of satire to comment upon the material conditions working for Disney or something like that, I might have a case for being able to have this IP for a satirical product because satire is like one of those weird copyright protection loopholes, which I think is a good one to have. And that's kind of like a different thing. So, should Disney be able to take away the IPs of people that satirize their work? Not legally now, at least, but you might be able to make your own kind of personal or moral argument in either direction. So, right. Yeah, and I was thinking of a book that wasn't successful upon release, but then it became a hit later on. And right, so that's kind of why I was trying to move away from the idea of it applying strictly to games abandonware, because copyright protections affect pretty much everything. It's so vast, the coverage of these laws, that tweaking them ever so slightly could have huge ramifications for what would come from that. Hey, Drew Wang, welcome into this stream. Nice to have you. You think Joji's suggestion is too rife to an angry mob deciding a company doesn't own a product anymore since they don't agree with what the company did with it? Maybe. Game copyright was tacked on, basically. Yeah, yeah. Like, these laws were created before, like, games were a thing back in 17, whatever it was. This is settled in the Garbage Pail Cabbage Patch Kids case. You're not at all kidding. Oh no, you're definitely right. Yeah, I kind of vaguely remember a little bit about that. That the Garbage Pail Kids were a very obvious knockoff of the Cabbage Patch Kids, and they did sue them, but it didn't work because the Garbage Pail Kids, although they were derivative, did have their own form of creativity and their own IP, and while they were mocking the Cabbage Patch Kids, they weren't actually really infringing upon the intellectual property of the Cabbage Patch Kids. Like, the Garbage Pail Kids definitely evokes Cabbage Patch Kids, but technically they're different enough, and the average Joe on the street is going to know that a Garbage Pail Kid is not necessarily a Cabbage Patch Kid. So, yeah. Chadwick says, if your satire is so similar that your product would not exist without the original setting of the design, then the satire must differentiate harder or pay license. They were hurting the potential of the Cabbage Patch brand. So did they lose or did they win that one? Because you might be right to an extent, but you might also be wrong. And the tricky thing about copyright and intellectual property and satire is that it's all on a case-by-case basis. And the rulings on cases relating to satire and things like that have been somewhat inconsistent from what my memory recalls. So I might be wrong about the Garbage Pail Kids, but you're pretty sure the Garbage Pail Kids got away with it because they were setting a wholly different product type, cards versus dolls. I'm gonna look it up. Cabbage Patch Kids versus Garbage Pail Kids lawsuit. After a licensing deal fell through, Garbage Pail Kids aimed and hit so close to the mark that the makers of Cabbage Patch sued them. Why it matters. I guess this doesn't really talk about it too much in depth. Judge agrees to put lid on garbage pail kids, while he considers whether they violate. Okay. So this is written in 1986, by the way. So this was kind of like, it's a fine line between parody and piracy. Okay, so that's not the outcome. Wikipedia. I'm surprised this is so far down the list. I've seen a lot of articles talking about how much worse Google search has become lately. And I feel like we could add this to the anecdotal evidence pile. You didn't mean to do this to chat. Too bad. I got curious, and now I want to know for my own sanity. International versions, very commercial success, controversies, and lawsuit. An out-of-court settlement, of course. Topps agreed to modify the appearance of the Garbage Pail Kids to remove the resemblance between the characters and to change the logo design. Production of the cards themselves continued, but by 1988, sales had dwindled and had a planned Series 16 was never produced. And that's not too surprising because like even the Cabbage Patch Kids really fell off towards the end of the 80s. Okay. So no like real legal precedent set by that. Anyway, I don't mind going off on that little tangent of exploration there. You really need to add Reddit to the end of Google search to find any info these days. Yeah, that is kind of a little life hack. Apparently, one thing that I learned very, very recently was the whole hacking of Google search by being able to get exact results by using quotes doesn't work anymore. I mean, it does for certain things, but it doesn't actually always show you what you're searching for in quotes anymore, apparently. Allegedly. I don't know if that's actually true, but oi. Isn't LA Times now? Okay. All right, so that was a really fun video to watch. Definitely got me a little bit fired up. So let's go ahead and transition into something completely different with Elden Ring lore. Explain It Like I'm 5 by Zahanjo. Drew says, it sounds righteous when you're talking about big companies, but you're talking about stripping works from living authors, etc. Yeah, and a lot of people don't really make it big within 30 years, and I like the idea of trying to have something continually on the market or within a certain period of time. I think that is pretty sensible, but there might be some unintended ramifications about that idea that might be worth exploring a bit further and all that. All right. So anyway, Elden Ring, Explain It Like I'm 5 by Zahanjo.
Well, hello, howdy, partner. I've just been spending the past couple weeks playing the hell out of some Red Dead 2.
Let me know how the volume is for you guys.
I'm in the wrong video. Not in any video? Oh, what the f***, man? I've been... What is this video called? Elden Ring. Oh, who gives a f***?
In search of the Elden Ring. Be assured, the Elden Ring resteth close at
Music's a
hand.
little loud compared to the
Godric the Golden.
Turn it down a little
Twin
bit.
Prodigies. General Radahn. Praetor Rykard. Princess Rani. Willful traitors. All.
Alright, this is the new thing I was talking about. So, personally, for little old me, I just find it a mighty shame that not too many people that even play the game understand much of his story. Alright, we're stopping with that. Although that wasn't a joke, I have been playing a lot of Red Dead 2 for like a while. I just got back into it. I never finished the story. Can you believe that? That game came out like 4 years ago, right? I think 2019. Anyways, Elden Ring. What is this? What am I doing? Is this a review, an essay, some rant about how unbalanced the weapons and bosses are? No, none of that. Instead, I'm attempting something super original that no one has done before on this platform, and if they have, they certainly aren't going to be as good as this video. Oh, that hurt to say. Alright, obviously joking. No, this is exactly what I just said. I do find it a terrible shame that most people who have played Elden Ring are not nearly as familiar with its lore that I think they could be. But hey, if you've played it and you're really just not into the idea of wanting to know what everything is about, that's cool, dude. More power to you. But for everyone else who does want to know, and for some reason you haven't checked out Vati Vidya's video on this topic, also try saying Vati Vidya 5 times in a row really fast. Vati Vidya's video. But that guy lays it out honestly perfectly, and not to mention with that smooth silky voice of his. Oh my god, that'll just put you right to sleep, but in a good way. So what do I have to bring to the table? Well, not that much honestly, just a different take in presentation. As much as I love Vati Vidya and several other channels like his that have also done amazing work in the research and presentation to lay out like such a dense plot for people to understand, as much as I love that, there's a little part of me that also feels like I'm listening to a lecture, and it's not really super stimulating. Beyond that, I do have a pretty limited attention span, which is why it took me so long to get back into Red Dead. I've had the game for almost 2 years and barely touched it until now. Anyways, this video isn't trying to one-up those awesome other works of theirs. The way I want this to come off as is like, say you and I were just hanging out, I don't know, say like chilling at a pub or having lunch or something, and you were like, hey, you played Elden Ring, right? What's the story there? That all looks super confusing. And I'm like, yeah, it is, but it's worth it. Let me tell you about it. So essentially, this is a friend telling you from their perspective. This is not like a college professor that's going to pull out a 30-page PowerPoint presentation. This is like casual chit-chat, you know? Because this...
I feel like I'm doing that awkward meme face where like I'm looking out of the side of my eye at the camera, being the dude that makes those 30-page PowerPoints and whatnot. So yeah, I honestly, it would probably be better for my channel if I did focus on dumbing some things down and making it a lot more digestible to a wider audience. But part of the problem with that for me, at least with Elden Ring in particular, is that there are still so many unknowns that I personally don't feel comfortable giving a lot of takes for things, because I don't like to close the door on a lot of possibilities, and I end up inadvertently opening more doors than I close when I also delve into the Japanese side of things. And talking about the Japanese aspect of the lore is also a real difficult thing to try to navigate, because I don't necessarily know how much anybody cares about the actual like nitty-gritty details of the linguistics between the languages, or whether or not they even really care what the difference is between something as innocuous as whether or not like Blythe is Ronnie's half-brother or stepbrother, and or whether or not Malekith is Marika's half-brother / stepbrother that uses the same terminology, stuff like that. And so I just try to focus on the things that I find interesting and just hope that resonates with as much of an audience as I can garner. And part of the reason I haven't made more videos in general is just because of those issues that I was talking about, where there's still so many unknowns. Like, I've got ideas, I've got theories, but I just kind of don't like sharing that stuff until it's at a level of polish that I'm more comfortable with. And Elden Ring, in comparison to the other games, feels a lot less polished, we should say. Yeah, looking at the camera like I'm on The Office, exactly. Captini likes how my stuff is compact and clear. This current video has been yapping for ages without going on to the subject. You would have skipped at this point. All right, yeah, I tend to try to get to the point as quickly as possible and just kind of stick with it, because that's just kind of my style. I like to, I mean, definitely not while I stream because I ramble so much. But yeah, I just that's why I don't have like the really long intro, like typical YouTube intro where like there's the whole slide that doesn't like do anything for the video. It's just like, oh, okay, it's there. I just tell you, hey, this is Fear the Old Lore. This is what I do. This is this topic, and that's pretty much it. So, yeah. All right, thank you, Joji. I appreciate that. Erudition guides the way. Yeah, and his global sequence says, and as I agree with, I'm bad with names. Zahanjo? Why did I remember that one a lot easier than mild conviction? I almost said mild inconspiracy. I'm so bad with names. All right, so Zahanjo was saying, like, there is not been a good video where, like, a lot of this stuff is really condensed and dumbed down to make sense to a 5-year-old and whatnot. So I definitely respect this as an endeavor, even if I think the intro is a little bit long and could have been shortened ever so slightly.
This is something I've had the urge to talk about since I first beat Elden Ring. So a bit of backstory, I've beaten the game 3 times and I platinumed it on my PS5. Not trying to flex, it really wasn't a nightmare. I actually genuinely enjoyed every playthrough that I did. To me, it felt almost impossible to re-experience the game the exact same way every time. There is just so much
What the hell? What sorcery is she casting? This is Millennia symbol on her robe, isn't it? Exactly. What in the hell? Scalise says, the recent trend with multi-hour videos has let people forget how much skill goes into condensing it down into something manageable. I know what you're referencing, but to be fair to Smotown, that's what his audience likes, and he has no reason to change because it's working for him. And people requested like the super long versions of those videos just to have like a pseudo playlist that's less of a playlist, and more power to him. I absolutely support his endeavor in making that content. Can't be a promo vid, right? Yeah, no, I mean, this is definitely promo material, but I don't think I've seen this, or if I did, it was at a time when I like didn't know what the hell this symbol meant.
It's impossible to re-experience the game the exact same way every time. There is just so much diversity and it's teeming with branching paths to the point where, especially on the first run, it almost feels like too much. And that's just the world. There are countless builds to try out and weapons to toy with and these awesome costume sets you find. It's fucking great, man. Oh, but I'm not here to gush on the game. I may just do that at some point, but I am seriously in love with this game and pretty much everything it has had to offer. Like, I'm not joking. We've got the wedding set for the new year and she's pretty much done with the planning. It's gonna be sick. And you know, when you're a fan of something, you want other people to feel that too, or at least try and convince them just enough to pique their interest into them giving it a go themselves. So that's what this is. Don't let the title mislead you. I'm not gonna talk down to you like a child. I'm just a fucking dweeb telling some people what the hell Elden Ring's all about. But if I'm gonna do this, I do want to set some stipulations and a little warning. Well, for the warning, I mean just like be patient with me. I've been doing movie reviews for several of the most recent uploads. I'm not ditching that. This isn't a shift in course for the channel. I'm not an Elden Ring channel now either, I promise. This might just be a one-off, but honestly, I'd totally be down for doing like a specific character or storyline deep dive in the future, but we'll see. I've never done an informative video like this, not to this extent. I'm more accustomed to talking about like my own opinions, and also if you've not played the game, all this is story spoilers. But I'm telling you that even if you've never played, what I'm about to lay out is like what I feel to be skimming the top of this iceberg. I'm just wanting to help new fans, current fans, or curious folk as to the general rundown for this game's story. So last thing, I'm not claiming...
Stella says, okay, now the intro length makes sense. Yeah, I'm feeling it now.
To be an expert, that I found all of this information on my own in terms of going into the game and finding the descriptions of the items and all that, because I didn't have the time to discover all of that on my own. My knowledge of this information is coming from an amalgamation of all kinds of sources, from the countless videos I've seen explaining this to the Elden Ring wiki to my personal take on going through the game 3 times. That's where all this is coming from. Whether you find that credible enough, I'll leave that up to you, but it's not like I'm trying to teach a history course on like real world events, although I could do that. I very much enjoy history. But no, like I said, this is just a fanboy talking about something he likes. And the really neat thing about really all...
And I think... I'm not going to bash him for trying to be very clear about where he's getting his information. And I don't know, like, part of me is just kind of sad that it feels like even for the dude who made the Explain It Like I'm Five video, he felt the need to have so many qualifiers to explain that he might not have everything right. So it just feels bad, man, that there's still so many unanswered questions that we have about the games. And so pretty much all of us content creators try to be as transparent as possible about like not actually having all the answers. So yeah, no hate against him for going into that spiel there. Reese be sleeping. You don't need to explain everything. If someone's about to play the game, just explain what you need to know starting out. Unfortunately, I do not know who Inferno Plus or Clemps are.
All of the Souls-like games from FromSoft is that there's not too much that is necessarily set in stone. It's a really neat dynamic where the history of their worlds and the backstory of it all can change within an instant. One item description or dialogue from a character can tell you something that absolutely changes the context for that piece of its history. So yes, their storytelling is very cryptid. I'm not looking to take away the experience of discovering the story the way they intended to. Their games are just so extensive and massive that that's not a super big concern of mine. I can't spoil everything. Honestly, no matter how much research you do, you can't really spoil. There's always something more to learn and discover, and I love that. Okay, we've beaten around the bush long enough. What are we talking about today? Well, my intentions here are to relay kind of a brief overview for the backstory of the game, and so my anchor point is going to be on the Erd Tree and the characters and creatures that influence its coming to being and what came after. So let's start with that. If you have a general knowledge on the game, even just seeing screenshots and its artwork, you're probably aware of the existence of this tree in the game. So what is it? What's the big deal about this tree? The Erd Tree stands not only as a symbol representing order and harmony in the lands between, but also works as an instrument orchestrated by its creator, which was sent to this plane by the Outer Gods. Said a couple titles there that sound confusing, so let's go back. The Erd Tree, you can essentially compare it to like the Tree of Souls from the first Avatar movie. All living things that die, their souls return back to this tree as a form of an afterlife. Or in Elden Ring's case, potentially, we don't know, used as a harvesting device to perhaps feed the Outer Gods. We're not entirely certain what happens within the Erd Tree after someone dies, but the souls that move from the realm of the living go into that tree. And the Lands Between is basically the title to describe the entirety of the playable areas in the game. So the
Yeah, I am a little bit concerned already that he's equating the Outer Gods having a kind of more direct relationship with the Erd Tree. It's not technically disproven by the game, and depending on how one feels about the greater will, he might not actually be wrong, but I don't think most people would say that the greater will is really like an outer god. If anything, it might be closer to an inner god if the greater will does actually have a strong current influence over the Elden Ring and whatnot. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to mention that for now.
playing field is the Lands Between. There's a powerful being / harvesting totem called the Erd Tree that exists within this land, and who put that there are generally known as the Outer Gods. See? Not so bad, just gotta break it down to chunks. Now, we're gonna talk about the tree.
Alright, yeah, of course, I don't entirely agree with that.
Known as the Outer Gods. See? Not so bad, just gotta break it down to chunks. Now, we're gonna talk about the
Hey, Rabid Baptism, welcome into the stream. How many Outer Gods are there? As many as Miyazaki wants there to be. And obviously that's kind of a bit of a non-answer, but I'm unironically being serious with that answer. And what I mean by that is there's many Outer Gods as they will put into the DLC to tell the story that they want to tell. But for now, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head. Whether or not the Frenzied Flame is an Outer God is kind of contentious, but you should, include that in the list because the, what's called the Gold Needle kind of implies that it is. Then you have the Formless Mother, potentially the God of Rot, you can consider an Outer God. There's also the possibility of the Fire Giant's God, the Fell God, as being an Outer God. So those are 4 of the big ones off the top of my head. And there might be a couple more that I just am failing to recall. I wouldn't say that the Twin Bird is an Outer God because the Twin Birds serve another being, which we don't really know too much of. But yeah, they are probably a good thing to add to the list, but not quite at the same level, it seems. Just call it a god tree and people know what you mean. Yeah, okay.
tree's creator, which are the Outer Gods, and the relevancy of the Greater Will. So, the Outer Gods, I kind of relate them to the gods from Greek mythology. They're active, but they're not a physical force seen within the game in the lands between. They're neither purely good or evil. Some seem to have their own agendas and ideas of how the world should function, but the only one we need to focus on right now, the main god that influenced the creation of souls and all living beings in this world, is the Greater Will. We'll call this entity Will, like a person. And Will does something that affects everything in the world with significant consequences. In a sense, Will basically kills, or you could say broke, the One Great, which created the ability for beings to have souls. After doing this, Will sends a star to the lands between, and along with that, a being called the Elden Beast. Now, this Elden Beast
So this isn't necessarily to contradict what he's saying here, but at least now we know that he believes the Greater Will is an outer god, which I'm fine with, even if I'm not like fully on board with that personally. I would just be more against the idea that the other gods also influenced the Elden Ring directly. Although, to be fair, I do think it is a possibility, because I have wondered whether or not the runes could have been related to previous beings, kind of similarly to how the mending runes work and whatnot. So if there's a rune of Scarlet Rot, where did that rune originally come from is one thing that I've wondered. And to be fair, it is also possible that the rune that has like Scarlet Rot associated with it could have like mirrored the nature of Millennia to be more like that. There's a lot of real strangeness and oddities associated with the runes and the so-called rune bearers and whatnot. But putting that stuff aside, what was the big point that I wanted to get to? Oh, right. So the Greater Will and the One Great. So as far as the Japanese goes, it could potentially be read as though the Greater Will and the One Great are the same thing in Hayata's dialogue. And so she could just be using two different names or two different epithets for the same thing. So the Greater Will could have just been one thing, but then the Greater Will made a mistake by like severing itself, I guess. But it's kind of all ambiguous, which is just kind of the FromSoft tradition at this point. Do I think Moog is evil? Well, I certainly don't think he's lawful good at least. So yeah, I personally don't believe in the concepts of good and evil. I just think, generally speaking, it's about whether or not somebody approves of something or disapproves of something. And so I don't really think evil and good offer a lot to work with.
a star to the lands between, and along with that, a being called the Elden Beast. Now, this Elden Beast functions as you could say, like the world police. It's meant to create and establish peace in a land that had no structure or order beforehand. And this beast is the physical manifestation of the Elden Ring, in which the Elden Ring is that logo right there, the Olympic-looking thing, that thing. This Greater Will, our buddy Will, here is also the one responsible for the creation of the Erd Tree, which houses the Elden Ring and the Elden Beast. We added some more names in there, so let's go back. From the top, the Outer Gods, beings which govern and influence the universe, including, where the game takes place, the land between. Within that land exists the Erd Tree, the beacon of souls for this world, and which also keeps the Elden Beast. See? Not too crazy so far. This feels like I'm doing an iceberg video. I just said that, but it is. It's like, I was from the very tippy top, and then we're gonna go. And then, but it's just amazing because, like, just the very peak of it, just sticking out, if you just go like 1 centimeter down from that, there's like a whole bunch of more lore, and it's like, nope, we're not doing that. We're gonna go nice big chunks here, because the further this goes along, the more complicated it becomes, which is true for any depiction of history. But the best way to learn, at least for me, besides the added visuals, is to start from a broad concept or name and then work my way down. So next, we're going to talk about the title of the game, that Elden Ring. Well, what is the Elden Ring? The name itself is a culmination of all sorts of special powers differentiated by runes. Runes with abilities that we can actually access ourselves in the game, and there's a variety of them, and totally worth trying them all if you're in the mood for replays, although some are just generally better than others in my opinion, and I just basically stuck with Godric's Great Rune in my first playthrough, and the reason we're able to even
Yeah, I think it's kind of ironic that the best rune is the first one you get, so it kind of disincentivizes people to experiment with the other great runes, the great wounds and whatnot. Hey Bella, welcome into stream. Sorry if I missed you earlier.
access those runes are because of a very important event before the present day, and that's the Shattering, which is exactly what it sounds like in that the Elden Ring, that thing, is broke. That thing gets broken, gets hammered the shit out of it. And then there is a war which breaks out over the ownership of these runes. Now, there's a lot that leads up to the Shattering, but again, right now, brief overview of things here. Because now that you know what the Elden Ring is, we're going to take a break and talk about the player's role in this world. So what is your purpose in all this here? Why are you?
So I'm a little bit disappointed that he didn't explain a little bit more about the Elden Ring kind of affecting the laws and the governance of the universe, and he kind of applied that more directly to the Elden Beast, which might make sense to a degree if you think the ring and the beast are the same thing. So maybe you should like let that go. I don't know.
Here? Well, unless you bought the game yourself or got in a bundle, in-game, no matter what name you give yourself in the intro, you are always referred to as the Tarnished. And without going into backstory that I don't want to discuss right this second, you are branded as such because of your inability to receive the grace from the Erd Tree, which means you can't really die. That grace is the ability to enter the afterlife and rebirth within the Erd Tree. And I know that begs the question, well, if there's no Erd Tree, then there'd be no afterlife. Honestly, I don't really know, but for the canon of this world, for the sake of argument, we'll just say that, sure, as far as we know, there's no afterlife outside of the Erd Tree. And your role in this game is the defining factor to how the lands between will operate from your involvement. You have several ways.
So yeah, there's a couple things here which I don't really like hold this against him because it's so nebulous. I don't expect him to understand that the description in the Helfen Steeple, which talks about the spirit world, could imply that there is another world beyond like the lands between. That's, one thing right there. But then the other was, hold on, let me look back. Oh yeah, the grace and the ability to quote unquote rebirth. Yeah, the grace stuff is strange because there are times where it seems as though the Tarnished has grace based off like the intro cinematic and whatnot. And then there are other times where it sounds as though we don't have grace. Like Godfrey calls us spurned by grace when we meet him as like before the final battles and whatnot. And I think other items allude to the Tarnished not having grace, but I don't necessarily agree with grace being the ability to be reborn by the Erd Tree, because Morgott is quote unquote grace given, and he doesn't necessarily get reborn by the Erd Tree. And if he is the only omen to have been given grace, that's kind of cool, and you might be able to argue that grace in that aspect could be like the remembrance that he leaves behind, perhaps. But if that were the case, it still leaves us with trying to figure out what the hell Moog has to do with everything else, because Moog may not have been grace given and is most likely not grace given because we don't really have evidence of it. And to be fair, the absence of evidence isn't evidence in and of itself, but nonetheless, I think it's noteworthy, and I want to be very clear about what we do and do not know. But so anyway, if Moog has not been given grace, but he also leaves a remembrance, we can't just tie the idea of remembrances to grace directly. And so Morgott doesn't revive, Moog doesn't revive. What the hell's the difference between the two? Morgott makes spooky ghost swords made out of gold. So what is grace really? We don't know. But nonetheless, I do kind of agree with the idea that there does seem to be a bit of an interplay with grace and the Tarnished being able to come back to the lands between. So if you lose your grace, do you not get revived by the Erd Tree? Potentially. So yeah, we just don't really know. And just wanted to bring that up. Hey Elden enthusiast, nice to see you again. When Godfrey says we're spurned, isn't he referring to when he and the Tarnished were originally banished? Maybe. I think he makes it sound like you are currently spurned, and I think there's some other indicators of that as well. I think maybe Morgott doesn't say it, but I would need to double check. Divine Purpose is a pretty good Eli 5 for you. Yeah, maybe that's a pretty good way of describing it, where grace could be duty, where the Tarnished are quote unquote cursed according to Roderica by Marika Sorry, let me rephrase that. Roderica says the Tarnished are cursed by Marika to do her bidding or something along those lines. And the goal of Marika seems to be to slay a god. Whether that god is her or the Elden Beast is arguable. I don't really want to get too deep down that rabbit hole right now, but that whole idea of cursing things and being tied to grace, because if grace is held within the eyes, that could tie into how the Marika and Radagon, Scar Seals and Sword Seals impress or impose a form of duty onto the cursed person, I guess. Anyway.
Is the defining factor to how the lands between will operate from your involvement. You have several ways to go about this. There are 6 total endings for this game. Each have their own consequences that I'd encourage you to research yourself, as I don't want to spoil them all, but I'm just going to talk about the first base ending, which I'm not sure if that's considered the true ending to the game, because each of the endings are pretty striking on their own, and I feel that it's really up to the players to decide where it should go. And you do, although my feeling is the default ending is probably the safest bet. But with the base ending, your end goal in the game is to eventually become the next Elden Lord. And in doing that, you have to mend the Elden Ring. When I say Elden Lord, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's becoming the next ruler of this land. To mend the ring, you have to gather the great runes which require you beating the bosses of the game. You don't have to beat them all, just the ones necessary to access entry into the Erd Tree. And honestly, this is it. If you just want to know the basic idea of what you're doing and why, then I feel this would be a good point in the video to stop. Really, honestly, because you as the Tarnished given grace, that gives you the ability to finally be resurrected again. You are able to come back from the Erd Tree, and your goal is just to put an end to the madness. That's it. That's the game. But if you want to stick around and get a bit more lore, please, happy to have you. Okay, so what's the next best step from here? Well, I think we should go back and talk a bit more about the lead up into the shattering and after, because to me that's really the meat and potatoes of what got me so invested in this lore, that time period and the time period shortly after the ring was shattered. But to do that, we're going to need to talk about Empyreans and what they are. New title card. So Empyreans is a title for people or beings that are special enough to be raised to the status of a god. The qualifications for that are not really known, and there's several ways to become one. However, the first and arguably the most important Empyrean we need to talk about here is Queen Marika the Eternal, and she achieved her god status by agreeing to become a vessel for the Elden Ring. In-game, there's currently 5 Empyreans that are known, and 2 of them are bosses you can fight in-game. So why is
I'm glad he included the Gek. Alright, Joji, thanks for dropping into the stream and leaving with that madman's knowledge. Although I don't entirely know what you mean with that the dragon sconces and Elden Ring are sounding. And anyway, thanks for dropping into stream. We will be going live again tomorrow with a couple more videos. So hopefully we'll see you then, 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Why is Queen Marika so important? Well, I'll tell you. So when you become an Empyrean, you can acquire what we can consider like a servant or a pet. And these are called shadows. Their full title are Shadowhound Beasts, but we'll just stick to calling them shadows. And Queen Marika is given a shadow called Malekith. Again, Queen Marika is a person who was granted god status and she received a shadow. And the queen does something which I interpret to be her trying to assure her immortality, because naturally when you become a god, hence you then become immortal. But these gods are not entirely unkillable, as there is a power which is known to be one of the only ways to truly kill a god. And that power is called the Destined Death. And Marika doesn't want that, but it's not entirely self-serving, as the removal of destined death through the Rune of Death is what enables everyone in a sense to have eternal life. According to what we know, all souls are reborn once given back to the Erd Tree, and Queen Marika removes this particular rune from the Elden Ring and has her shadow Malekith to guard the Rune of Death from being used. At least without her consent, theoretically, which upon doing so created a new era and structure taking the form of the Golden Order, which is more of a set of beliefs than a literal organization. Best way to think of it is that it's a religious belief. That belief is the mental backbone, kind of like the philosophical safety net for many, many people in the lands between. Again,
so I really like this promotional image, and one thing that stood out to me looking at it was this is kind of the inverse of Golden Order Totality, or maybe you could say Golden Order Totality is the inverse of this, which uses the Blessing of the Erd Tree incantation, or this might actually be Elden Stars. But rather than the palms being upward in this pose, Golden Order Totality has it downwards, and you can see that in things like Litany of Proper Death, for example. It's all good. being a bit late, Bella. I appreciate you dropping in when you can.
Backbone, kind of like the philosophical safety net for many, many people in the lands between. Again, Marika is ascended to godhood, she gets a shadow, she removes destined death from the lands between, and establishes the Golden Order. Now, before going into explaining what the Golden Order is, let's take a break. If you're anything like me, when you're learning or studying something, taking a break is good for the mind, but if you're ready for more, skip the time code right here. Alright, so what are we going to talk about for a break here? For a second I thought about kind of stealing. Okie dokie, back to the video. Enough talking about myself. The Golden Order, its fundamentals are based on two principles, and I quote, the law of regression, the pull of meaning and the yearning to converge, and the law of causality, the pull between things which link all things in a chain of relation. Big words, big stuff. What is this garbled mess? Well, breaking it down basically is that it's all connected. There's a desire to collate in that there's a purpose to it. I take it as that it means there's a fate and that nothing happens on its own as a whim, and that there's a purpose to that and a desire to resolve itself on its own. Like a roundabout belief in the circle.
Yeah, I tend to think of it as in the whole Newtonian concept of for every action there is a reaction, which is kind of like the whole idea of causality, which is one of the foundational parts of the Golden Order philosophy. I don't exactly know how regression is supposed to really fit into that. I've wondered whether or not the regression is kind of taking a section of causality and then kind of reversing it, which is what more or less imposes the stasis onto the lands between. If we take the golden tinged excrement description at face value, which is kind of funny mental image right there anyway, that for better or worse, things remain as they are in the lands between. And so there's another aspect of regression that I want to talk about, although I'm struggling to find the words for it. Immutable. Okay, yeah. So I wondered whether or not regression leads into immutability, which is part of one of the other tenets of... Okay, yeah, no, it is very explicit. Okay. I've got it for you guys over here on my spreadsheet. That, according to Immutable Shield, two concepts form the basis for the Golden Order's fundamentalism. One is the law of regression, to which this incantation relates. So, for what it's worth, Immutable Shield negates all types of non-physical damage and ailments, which is pretty crazy. And I think if immutability can be tied to regression, that just kind of links back to what I was talking about with causality and regression kind of being the basis for the stasis in the lands between. Radagon says he was studying causality when all he did was play with dominoes. But he would set those dominoes back up if he knocked them down. Yeah, exactly. Gold-tinged excrement is also immutable.
Of life. Eventually, things come back together and dissipate. I went deeper into that because the Golden Order is a prominent belief that comes up several times during the game, and you can kind of structure how you see the lands between functioning within that belief, which is really, really amazing. And it's not even the only religion in the game, but we're not going to get into that. But you can think of the Golden Order as the dominant religion in this land. It's just incredible because, especially once you know the backstory to the religions and some of the beliefs, that you can actually see the world through the characters' lenses in that way. It can be I can see why you believe in that, or why, well, some of them, not all, some of them are just all right, you're just an asshole. But besides that, it's just really engaging because the Golden Order is kind of you can feel that in the world. It's literally happening before your eyes. You are a part of that in a sense, and I just really like that idea. I think it's really cool. I've never played a game that has a religion that you can actually, if you're open-minded, just take a moment and be oh, I am a part of this process. I am contributing to this. This is all happening because of this, and I love that. It's so good. Marika is a god. Malekith.
If he really likes this, I would kind of recommend playing Final Fantasy X. They did an amazing job really fleshing out a kind of fictional religion that I'm not sure that I've seen done better in another game, which isn't to say that it hasn't happened. I just haven't seen its equivalent yet. Oops.
Is her shadow. She removes death and allows for rebirth in the land and creates the Golden Order. Now, at that time, just creating a new order didn't mean instantaneous peace. There were several battles and wars taking place for rule over the Erd Tree between Marika and this land's inhabitants. As a result, Marika got herself a hubby. She takes herself a consort named Godfrey, and he acts primarily as Marika's vessel of war to conquer the other factions, as well as becoming the first Elden Lord. And Godfrey, also known as Horalu, the Lord of the Battlefield. God, I love this boss. And fighting him only gets better, or debatably more emotionally conflicting, once you learn a bit of his backstory. This man took down the fire giants. For reference, you fight just one of these fuckers in game, and he is more than a handful. In the war against the giants, can you imagine how much of an unstoppable force he must have been in order to conquer them? He is so cool. I just love his design. I know he seems so stripped down compared to the other boss designs, but I really had an aggravatingly fun time going up against him every time.
Stripped down, you say? I wonder why. Chadwick just made pancakes. They're delicious. Nice. I actually had pancakes for dinner as well.
I don't know. I think I'm just a sucker for that classic barbarian warrior design. And not to mention that lion pelt. I mean, that's his stand too. He's like a JoJo. I don't know shit about JoJo, but he's like a JoJo character. Reference. Get it? Because within the story, unfortunately, once Godfrey had finally conquered the lands for his queen, she cuts him loose. Get the fuck out of here. Just literally banishes him. Even after they bear 3 kids together, she actually banishes him from the lands between, and he becomes the very first of the Tarnished. Oh, my...
Scally said, it took 5 games, but FromSoft finally did the Just Loves fighting so much trope that manga uses all the time. Man, you be looking over Ishin Ashina. It's really weird saying his name backwards like that in English style. Anyway, yeah, no, my man's, he lived for the battlefield too. Elden Enthusiast likes to think Godfrey power dived through the fire giant's chest in succession during the war. And is that where we get all the thorns from?
My dude, I am so sorry. A moment of silence for Godfrey. But not that long, because this guy's still an asshole. He's just hard as fuck. I had, my god, how many tries? I don't even want to know. 3 playthroughs? I got easier each time, but still. But alright, getting ahead of myself. Marika and Godfrey have 3 children in the time of their marriage. Those children are Godwyn the Golden, Morgott, and Mohg the Omen twins. The later 2 are actually bosses you can fight in-game, with Morgott being the only one required for the default ending. And we're going to talk about one of them specifically because their death is what sets off the beginning of the Shattering. Godwyn the Golden, Marika's firstborn, is assassinated during the Night of the Black Knives. Now, how could he be killed? He's a demigod and supposed to be immortal. The only way he could die is from the Rune of Death. Correct. Godwyn was assassinated with daggers that possessed the Rune of Death. But with Malekith guarding the rune, how could that happen? Well, the person actually responsible for that is this mischievous little witch right here, the Lunar Princess Ranni. And she actually has a quest line that affects one of the 6 endings in the game too. You'll run into her at some point. For sake of brevity, she steals it. She pulls a heist, she pulls an Ocean's 11, and just swipes it underneath Malekith's nose. Nobody notices. Until... But Godwyn's death is very significant to Marika, as he is basically her favorite child of the 3. Without it getting too overwhelming, I'll just say that his death is also more significant based on the fact that being killed with the rune, his soul was killed as well as his body, which means there wasn't a chance for his soul to return to the Erd Tree. And that's really what ticks Marika off. And that is the reason the Elden Ring is broken, the Shattering. After the assassination, Marika loses it and takes her hammer and goes to town on that thing. Just imagine the rage, guilt, and grief of this mother pounding away on the symbol that had a part in killing her son. We've got one last chunk of lore in the story that I want to go through, and that'll be it for this video. I'm not sure if there'll be a part 2, really just depends.
All right, so yeah, there's a lot of contention surrounding Marika's motivations for shattering the ring, and I'm not really going to like poop on what Zahanjo was saying there. I do think it's very relatable to look at Marika through the lens of motherhood and kind of being driven to the brink from grief, but there is also the possibility that Marika could have been in on the plot to some degree, and part of the reason why she may have needed to shatter the ring was because Godwyn's death may have exposed a flaw within the Golden Order, or if not Godwyn's death itself, the death root that sprouted because of Godwyn's death could have exposed a flaw in the Golden Order, which could have pushed her to the brink. So I don't feel like talking too much more about that, but I just wanted to highlight that as a contrasting possibility for why she may have felt forced to shatter the Elden Ring and pushed to the brink.
Depends on how this goes. Maybe this is all too convoluted, but I hope not. I've had a nice time working on this. It's a nice change of pace. But yes, refresher. The Golden Order is established. Marika weds Godfrey and gets to work conquering the lands between. They have children, and as a result of their firstborn's assassination by Ranni the Witch, Marika shatters the Elden Ring. Man, when you put it all in a general layout like that, it really puts things in perspective, because just researching on the Golden Order brings you down this rabbit hole of all the other beliefs and how they came to be. And that's why I love this lore so much, man. And it's nice, at least for now, it's all coming from one game, one source. Like, at least we don't have to read compendiums spanning years to get a basic understanding of things. It's great.
Meanwhile, all of the serious lore heads be looking at the Miyazaki interviews for the tiniest tidbits of information that they could possibly get.
To me, this was the most enjoyable time I've had in learning backstory like this. And Bloodborne's a good one too. And now, now that's an idea. So Queen Marika, she shatters the Elden Ring and everything is honky-dory. Yeah, no, all chaos breaks out, because now these shards of the ring, these runes with incredible power, are launched all across the lands between, just sitting there, out of the fire and into the frying pan. And as you can imagine, the beings which are above Marika aren't too happy with this development. It's uncertain whether it was the Greater Will or the Elden Beast, but something more powerful than Marika came and imprisoned her within the Erd Tree as punishment. And that is where she remains until you confront her again once you finally enter the Erd Tree. And the moment that the Elden Ring was shattered, that is what enabled the Tarnished that had died to return back to life once more, including my man Godfrey. So his ex-wife ditched him after he just served his purpose, right? And I'm a Tarnished, he's a Tarnished, we share a common goal, so let's work together and get you some revenge, dude, right? He's the third to last boss in this game. His only desire of vengeance is on you for killing his son Morgott. Besides that, based on my takeaway from his introduction, all my guy wants to do is see Marika again, to be granted audience. And I love that. I think that's so touching and sad, especially because we have to kill him. Like, I would have loved to have seen that scenario where he reunites with Marika, but he'd also be in for quite the surprise when he did. I'm sure he'd be a little more than confused. Should I explain that? Long story short, Marika's new husband and her kind of fused to become one and the same person, or one becomes the other, either or, so that's why I said that. You could research that if you want, we're just not going to get into that right now. Yeah, but that's it. That's the last bit of lore I want to talk about. There's still
I'm really surprised that he didn't go into more of that stuff between Marika and Radigan, or when and why Godfrey became tarnished. So maybe that's not entirely relevant. I don't know, but maybe it's a little bit of a disservice at the same time. Elden Enthusiast says Godwyn is literally the Little Mermaid. He's an Undyne. They are water nymphs / spirits that do not possess a soul, and Undyne or Undine is the main character of the OG Little Mermaid story. Yeah, that's one thing that is brought up quite often in relation to Godwyn. Maybe not like the Little Mermaid specifically, but like the Fiji Mermaid and all that stuff. You still can't get down with America's master plotter take. Yeah, I feel like I don't like it either, but I mean, the text descriptions all but say it directly, you know? Sucks to suck.
So much more we could talk about. I skipped through a lot of information, but like I said, I just wanted this to be a summary of what I feel would be a solid foothold in the door to get you into the story of Elden Ring. So,
all right. I'm actually just gonna unceremoniously stop the video, just because I feel like a lot of it's just going to be rambling, and a lot of this was kind of off-topic rambling, which is fine, but it's not necessarily for me. So yeah, I'm not actually gonna like the video just because like the rambling stuff annoyed me a bit, as well as getting the little bits with like the outer gods and stuff a little bit off. But nonetheless, I don't think this was a bad video. I'm definitely not going to dislike it. He also made it abundantly clear that he like what he was operating off of. So I think it's a respectable attempt on Zahanjo's part right here. Nonetheless, I'm going to link it into chat. If you guys want to give it a like and or give him a subscribe, you're more than welcome to do so. Thanks for letting me check that out. So let's go ahead and transition into a bit more of a heavier lore topic, perhaps, or more focused one, with A Crucible Knight Analysis, The Strongest Warrior in Elden Ring by Ontos. I'm not sure how one pronounces that. So we didn't get to watch this the other night because I took too long reacting to other stuff. So let's go ahead and dive on in tonight. Have I ever thought about an avatar like this presenter? I've got like the Pepe Ofnir thing, I guess. But no, not really. I'm not into the whole VTuber-esque facade. It's just not my style, I suppose. All right, Elden Enthusiast, you have a good night. Yeah, you see me as the conspiracy board Gideon because the live stream's not going to lie? Well, hold on. We can change that. Or no, I can't. I think I have a Gideon underneath my Gideon, which is even funnier if that's true. Let's do that. Yeah, okay. All right, anyway, not too important. Catgirl avatar would work for me? No. Okay. So, A Crucible Knight Analysis, The Strongest Warrior in Elden Ring by Ontos.
Crucible Knight Evergaol is one of the most underrated. The Crucible Knight Evergaol is one of the most underrated and mechanically rich boss fight, not just in Elden Ring, but possibly in the entire Souls franchise. Almost no one talks about it, yet it is one of the most enjoyable bosses in the entire game to master for posture breaks. See, what is so baffling to me is that there is no well-executed no-hit runs on YouTube with level 1 club for Crucible Knight.
It's kind of funny because I do have like an early melee build guide for it, but I'm not too into the one or no-hit strats, so I just kind of like gave a brief rundown of his movements and how to counter them. But yeah, I really do like aspects of the Crucible Knight fight, although it was definitely infuriating having to relearn some of his attack patterns when he actually got into phase 2. So this was a very challenging boss to fight early on, but I've also seen people kind of trivialize the Crucible Knight by being overleveled for it, which I feel a little bit saddened by. So that's just kind of the nature of Elden Ring. You either get curb stomped or you do the curb stomping. It seems like there's no in-betweens.
Run where you're not parrying constantly to avoid his extremely complex moveset, but answering all his moves with the well-timed dodges and executed punishes. This boss is so challenging and complex that not even challenge runners who are supposed to master bosses isn't fully able to, and they just parry him instead, or they play more passive play by running away.
Is that really a fair criticism that they just parry the Crucible Knight? I mean, that's a viable strategy for getting through the game. I don't understand why they shouldn't do it. This almost reeks of the argument of how people shouldn't use spirit summons because it cheapens the experience. So I'm not entirely sure I am like on board with this. Not a viable criticism? Maybe, yeah. Yeah, I do agree that the dual Crucible Knight with Ordovis and the Silurian Knight is a pain. That one's pretty rough. VTuber thing sounds like a pain to set up. Oh yeah, it definitely is. If you have questions about like VTubers and stuff, you could ask Reese because he has worked on that kind of stuff extensively and knows way more about it than I do.
I'm not taking anything from parrying. However, I would be making the argument here that parrying is not something you do to avoid learning the moveset of the boss. Parrying, just like all styles of playing, should be a personal preference and not a means to conveniently circumvent relentless combo branches. This is a video that will hopefully remedy this overall perception of this incredible boss. And I have to show you guys how amazing and enjoyable it is to fight this guy, level 1, club, and no parry.
I don't know how I feel about that. Like, I mean, definitely play the game the way that you want to, but I don't know if it's fair to like criticize people that parry because it makes the fight easier. Like, if you want a more difficult fight, then why are you using a club? Just use your fists, forehead.
Purely by mastering his moveset with insane level of aggression and posture breaking him left and right. Crucible Knight has a branching moveset that is more complex than almost all the shard bearers in Elden Ring. That is, if you attempt to answer each of his attacks and punish him properly. If you
I mean, yeah, those kind of statements are just kind of hard to respond to at times. Like, I don't necessarily disagree with some aspects of it. It's just like the other stuff that he added with, like, if you try to answer them properly. I don't know what he specifically means by properly. I think, in general, if you try to counter every one of the swings, you're going to have a bad time, because the Crucible Knights do have chaining combo attacks, and that can be a very painful thing to learn, as I definitely did as I went through and made my early melee build guide of how to fight the Crucible Knights. But the quote-unquote proper way, I guess, to punish them, in my eyes, would be to do it when they are not going to be able to strike you back, which means when they're either done in their combo chain or while they're executing the last move and you've already moved out of the way or, parried it and whatnot. So, with that being said, I would definitely agree that the Crucible Knights can be as or more complex than the Shard Bearers with their kind of combination attacks. And I do think they are a really, really fun boss fight to 1v1 without spirit summons and kind of like struggle against them and like learn their attack patterns, even if it can be a little bit frustrating, especially as they get into phase transitions and whatnot. Honestly, one of the bigger complaints that I did have about the Crucible Knight was that some moves, telegraphs, are completely indistinguishable from other moves and are kind of contingent on phase transitions, which is very, very unintuitive and feels a little bit like metagaming to know, like, okay, now that this dude is in phase 2, he's not just going to do the one tail sweep, he's going to do 2 tail sweeps. So anyway, yeah. All right, Mr. Yada, you have a good night, and thanks for jumping in the stream. You don't get how mastering the if I'm good enough at this, you won't hit me tool is a bad thing? Yeah. Elden Ring can't truly be appreciated until you're doing a level 1 no-hit drum kit controller run. Exactly.
You guys remember my previous video on defending Elden Ring's bosses? I have made the argument that it is possible to beat all of these bosses while baiting at 1 or 2 attacks and running away for the rest. But that's not how you access the deepest mechanics of the game. The inherent nature of unpredictability that resides in Crucible Knight, especially in the second phase, is so high that no challenge runner attempts to evenly maintain aggression throughout the fight to get those sweet posture breaks. Always maintaining some sort of distance periodically, constantly waiting for him to initiate the first attack to get the safest of punish windows. And although that is understandable for a no-hit run, as you can clearly see from the gameplay, that is not how I master Elden Ring's combat.
Yeah, so I don't understand his argument here. Is he trying to say, like, doing this is better than a no-hit run as far as, like, the skill goes? It just feels a little bit all over the place. I don't know if I'm going to watch this entire video because it seems kind of biased. That's not the word that I'm like trying to think of, but it's what came to mind. Hard to tell what he's doing? Okay. I see your brother and Moog just play Soul Calibur if you want a fencing match. Yeah, what POV is this guy coming from? A no-hit, a challenge run, a speed run? Because it would be one thing if it's like a no-hit, but I don't understand the criticizing, the parrying. I don't understand like him just saying now that he doesn't approach it like a no-hit run. So maybe he's just coming at it from like a soul level 1 run or rune level 1 run, I guess. That's my guess now.
Posture breaking is the name of the game, and you guessed it, almost none of the no-hit runs on YouTube can reliably and consistently posture break the Crucible Knight. When you compare Crucible Knight with Margit, for instance...
So yeah, that's just kind of a fallacious statement to begin with, a value statement that posture breaking is the name of the game. It's not. It's Elden Ring. I mean, obviously, we're both being a little bit hyperbolic here, but you don't need to posture break the bosses to kill them, and sometimes it's just not conducive to beating the boss to by posture breaking them. So when I was first playing through Elden Ring, I wanted to posture break all the bosses and get footage of it, which I kind of did, but I literally spent probably 200 resets trying to posture break Radahn and get to his head to actually initiate the visceral attack based off his stupid ass hitbox before I finally did it. And guess how many times I've used that footage after all? 0 times. Anyway, that's not too important, but posture breaking, I think, is not as well implemented into Elden Ring as it could have been, and I think it would have been augmented much, much, much better if posture was something that was more influenced by strength attacks or weapon weight, just so that way there's a different avenue of viability for ultra heavy weapons or colossal weapons, stuff like that could counterbalance how faster, more dexterous weapons could have more reliable access to bleed and or frost. And to go along with that, I think limb breaks should have definitely been incorporated into Elden Ring as well to kind of round all of these systems out. Ontos Lore's videos are better than the fight analysis ones in your opinion? You might be right, but to be fair, I didn't know this was not a lore video. I thought it kind of was, which that might be on me. If there was a rune that showed posture, would usurp Godric's as the best one? Yeah, for real though.
None of the no-hit runs on YouTube can reliably and consistently posture break the Crucible Knight. When you compare Crucible Knight with Margit, for instance, he has an increased resistance to posture breaking as a whole. It takes so much more aggression to be able to posture break Crucible Knight. When you compare him to Malenia, he has an incredibly high poise where he doesn't flinch from any attack. So it's not an option to use aggression as a clutch in order to stop attacks mid-execution like in Malenia.
So staggering is different than posture breaking as well. So I feel like they're kind of making false equivalent arguments. But yeah, I mean, it can be hard to posture break Crucible Knight, but I mean, I feel like he's just making a way bigger deal about this than it actually is. Although I might be coming at it from an angle where I've played the Crucible Knight more similarly to this dude, where I don't like parrying in Elden Ring for a variety of reasons. And so I just, fought him mano a mano, and I would just posture break him quite a bit. But anyway.
In many of my runs, I was sure that my level of aggression was enough to posture break Crucible Knight. However, it wasn't. You have to be absolutely relentless to get your punish, and unlike in Margit, where some leeway and passivity is allowed, Crucible Knight simply does not. And if you've played Crucible Knight by baiting out a few attacks, thinking that he's so aggressive that posture breaking is impossible, and that's the best anyone can ever do, I hope that my final run here, which we'll get to at the end of my video, will fill you with inspiration. The inspiration to try him out next time yourself, to humiliate him. In my first playthrough of Elden Ring, I have beaten this Evergaol, this Crucible Knight, as a 10 Vigor Wretch with a Claymore +2 in my hands. Make no mistake, that was a very challenging fight, and I've loved every second of it, mastering a good number of his moves before defeating him. However, after coming back to play with him with a club, level 1, naked, and with posture breaking in mind, I've realized his complexity was significantly higher than I've given him credit for. The weapons you use in Elden Ring tangibly changes your punish styles and windows. We've touched upon this in my analysis video before. A claymore is a long reach weapon. Club is a way shorter weapon in comparison. With claymore you can take less swings but make them count. With a club you can swing more but you need to make it contact with such an aggressive boss with so narrow punish windows. It makes your job that much harder. A claymore has a length that I don't have to think about spacing that much. When I do a roll R1, for instance, I know that a claymore will at least contact Crucible Knight because of the length of the weapon. But roll R1 with a club is completely different. Your dodge needs to land in close proximity to him for your roll R1 to even make contact. And you don't have the time to get close to him most of the times because the punish windows are extremely narrow for Crucible Knight. You have to be very precise in your dodges and rolls. So unlike my first playthrough where the long reach of my claymore made spacing more straightforward, I've realized how much more challenging he was to fight with a club, how hard it is to fill that posture bar, how hard it is to dodge in a way where it is possible to punish him afterwards. But before we get deeper, I want to show you my suffering. Let's look at how my fresh and beginner level gameplay looks like with Crucible Knight. How little understanding and confidence I have with my attacks, and how much stronger of a grasp in terms of battle techniques that Crucible Knight has.
Yeah, this video just isn't for me. Like, it feels like he's imposing a lot of arbitrary restrictions on himself, and it makes it sound as though, like, he's saying this is the way that you should fight Crucible Knight. Even if he hasn't, like, literally said that, I just don't understand the point of this. I think it's one thing to celebrate and appreciate an enemy's movesets and all of that stuff, but I just do not for the life of me get why he's going on and on about the club versus the claymore, or why he's putting down parrying, which, I mean, I get, like, the whole posture break thing. Yeah, that's totally a viable way of doing it. But, I mean, what's to stop me from saying, oh, idiot, you're doing it wrong. Don't just use the club, also use a shield, and then use the guard counters, so that way when he does his final move, you have a longer window to punish him because you'll guard counter and then be able to get an extra hit after that, depending on the move that he does. And then when you realize that he's going to two-hand the weapon and do the 5-hand combo attack, you two-hand your weapon, and then you roll away at the last one, and then you do a jumping attack to do more posture damage. Like, these are just kind of all arbitrary restrictions that don't really matter, and, you know, this also kind of isn't lore and just interests me less in general. So, yeah, I'm just going to stop this video here, which, like, nothing against Ontos, but kind of something against Ontos. Not really, just, like, the style of the video is not for me on multiple levels. So I'm going to go ahead and link this into chat for you guys if you want to check it out on your own later. I really do like the Crucible Knight fight. As I've said, like, multiple times throughout this, I made a guide for it within, like, the first week of the release of, like, how to fight the Crucible Knight, just doing, like, pure melee stuff without parrying. And it's funny because, like, a lot of the comments in that video were like, oh yeah, you could just parry him and he's, like, way easier. Well, yeah, that's if the player has the ability to parry, but the focus of my video is, like, highlighting the Crucible Knight's moves and trying to make it clearer which ones can be punished and how without relying on parrying. So he's saying it's a higher skill cap to do it at RL1 with a club. Right, but I mean, is that a specific challenge mode? Why not RL1 with a claymore or any other weapon? That's what I don't understand. Why didn't he use a dagger as an example instead of a club? That's a good question, Fearless Noob, and I think that would unironically be due to how you're pretty much never going to get a posture break with a dagger, even under the most ideal of circumstances. That would be my guess. You can easily get 2 to 3 hits with the dagger. He seems to be talking about posture breaking as the name of the game, which I feel like is just kind of a personal argument. He's patting himself on the back for doing what he's doing, yeah. Yeah, he's got 2 to 4 combos and enough punish windows to do them without spells or parry. And that seems to be the crux of his argument, that even challenge runners don't do it without parrying, and because he's just too hard. But I feel like the reason they don't do it without parrying is because parrying is the path of least resistance, and people are going to do the path of least resistance, you know? So yeah, I just don't really get this video. So anyway, all right, yeah, I'll just go ahead and move on into the next video for the night with the rarest enemy in Elden Ring lore by Zeostorm, and these were the cemetery shades on the thumbnail. Yesterday I was theorizing it might be the glintstone crabs and Rhea Lucaria. I thought there was only one, but apparently there's two. I think it was like without horns who said that there were two. I don't remember. I'm sorry. So let's go ahead and dive on in.
All right, what's going on? Alright, what's going on, guys? In a game as visually evocative as Elden Ring, where so much of the understanding of the game's world relies on visual storytelling and communication by unspoken cues, it's unsurprising that there are going to be a lot of things that the majority of players don't understand, and oftentimes that has to do with the inhabitants of the game's world. Here on the channel...
Oh yeah, another thought that I did have for like a potential rarest enemy could be the Mimic tier. Because there's only kind of two in the game. So there's the one in Nokron, sort of. Or, yeah. That one and the one in the Consecrated Snowfield, like, secret area.
We've been taking a deep dive into the unknown, exploring the lore of Elden Ring's most mysterious creatures, and today we have quite possibly the rarest one, a creature of which only one regular variant appears in the entire game, and that is the Cemetery Shade. Today we'll be attempting to tell their story, and what little there is of it, because like their sparse appearance in the game's world, these creatures are equally as singular in the lore, but it's that very...
I'm curious what he means by regular variant.
Infrequency that establishes potential connections to so many other aspects of the lore that only makes the mystery even more interesting. So as we get into that today, if you enjoy all things Elden Ring and want to stay up to date on the news, lore, and discussion, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and now let's get into it. When we think about oddities in this game, there are more than enough mysteries to be found on the surface, but for every strange thing above, there's an equal amount below, many of which can be found in Elden Ring's catacombs, the places where those deemed as heroes in the lands between are taken after their death to be assimilated into the Erdtree's roots, in the hopes of a rebirth somewhere beyond. But stranger among the bones of the dead are the things down here that are still alive. As the player journeys through the catacombs of Elden Ring, they'll find all sorts of inhabitants and living creatures, many of which serve a vital role in maintaining the catacombs and fulfilling their purpose, among others that potentially ended up here by circumstance. Oftentimes it's hard to tell the difference, but the rarest and strangest of all these creatures are the Cemetery Shades. There's a total of 4 Cemetery Shades in the entire game, 3 of which serve as the final bosses of the respective catacombs in which they inhabit, and a 4th lesser non-boss version that is so out of place and hidden that it makes no sense why it's even there, and you probably wouldn't even notice it if somebody didn't tell you about it beforehand. But to begin understanding what they are, let's start with their appearance. Cemetery Shades are...
So I think the regular variant he's talking about is just like the non-boss version. So yeah, I don't remember which one that appears in, to be honest.
Are very lanky creatures, humanoid in appearance, with very bright glowing eyes and an insectish creature on their head. They wield 2 curved blades that have a very rugged and weathered appearance, with many chips in the edge. But something even weirder about them is how they're constantly covered in this black mist. But thanks to modding tools, we can get a very close look at these creatures and the different components that make them up. And the thing on their head is a spider crab. The Cemetery Shades actually have one attack where you can see this crab in action. After getting caught in their web blast, the crab will separate from the head temporarily in order to latch onto the player and stab them with their legs. It's an attack that does have a bit of a more horror aspect to it than one of fantasy that you might expect, when in a game like this you'd expect these creatures to have some kind of magical ability. And I think that...
So Fearless Noob says he's in the hero's grave in Mount Gelmir. Interesting. The Mount Gelmir hero's grave? I'm trying to remember where he is in that one, because yeah, it just doesn't fit in my mind's eye. Because I know like the Bloodhound Knights, but I couldn't place where the Cemetery Shade is. It's on loan from the Yarnum collection. He's in one of the alcoves you hide in to avoid the chariot. Is he? Oh, okay, that's probably why. I don't remember. Because I don't know if I've really even tried to hide in those alcoves so much. Maybe my first playthrough? But all the other ones I rode the chariot. Okay, that makes sense. You did that dungeon this week, so you remembered? Nice, thank you, appreciate that. Yeah, so the funny thing is, after I beat Elden Ring, I was like, okay, I just like want to look at the trailer again to see what all I'm like to remember it, because as I was getting closer to the release of Elden Ring, I kind of like stopped consuming all content for it, so that way it didn't pollute my experience. Where it's like, oh, I know what this is because I saw it here in the trailer, and so after I finished, I went back and I saw the Tarnished riding a chariot, and I was like, what the hell? So I had to go back and figure out like how you could do that, and that just kind of like blew my mind. It was pretty easy to figure out was the Gelmir chariot because like the lava and whatnot, but kind of really funny that that stuff was in the trailer. And also, speaking of the funny stuff that's been included in the trailers for FromSoft games, the the third ending for Bloodborne is totally in one of its trailers. It's not as though you can exactly see the squid baby, but it shows the doll holding the tentacle boy with the little tentacles sticking out. So you don't get the clearest of looks, but the third ending is right there in the trailer, which is really funny. Okay.
Warrants a closer look at the crab. Now, spider crabs are absolutely a real creature, but you'll notice two very large antennae on this crab. These are actually from a different animal altogether. They come from the Australian horror moth and are actually balloon-like glands used to attract mates. Now, I highly doubt the cemetery shade is trying to attract mates, but it may actually add credence to another idea. Given that the underbelly of the crab has this glowing light, the same of which we can see coming out of the eyes of the shade, I believe it can be generally inferred that the crab is in control of the body. And this can
Yeah, I definitely think the crab is in control, although I do think the crab's light is ever so slightly blue, whereas the cemetery shade's eyes are white. Although I guess I don't know what is the shade and what is the crab.
the shade. I believe it can be generally inferred that the crab is in control of the body, and this can be supported by the only factual lore we have about these guys, and it can be found in the description of their weapon, which is called the Mantis Blade. That description reads as follows: a curved sword with a blade at both ends wielded by the cemetery shades, the insect-ridden gravekeepers. The blade is thin and sharp, and strong attacks unleash a far-reaching slash. So
Yeah, I really like the idea of those weapons. I just wish there was something more to them. I kind of wish they were more like the amygdalin arm in Bloodborne, or could like use trick attacks where they could extend a bit more. Because other than the fully charged R2, the range is kind of not great, and there's not a lot of incentive to really use this weapon, and they're kind of rare, and I don't think most people are going to get them. Of course, that moth is from Australia. Yeah. You just realized Metroid music was going and you kind of forgot what was happening. Yeah, so Zeostorm likes to use a lot of Metroid stuff in his videos. Because, I mean, even if you look at his logo, it's very much Metroid inspired. He's a huge fan of the series.
So that explains to us the purpose the shades are in the catacombs for, that they serve as keepers of the grave, and also explains why they play the role of the boss of the catacombs, even though they are fairly weak. But another thing to note about their appearance are two gaping holes in their chest and missing stomach, and this could be a clue to understanding what they are, especially given the location in which we find them. All of these shades can be found among the Erdtree roots where the bodies are assimilated, and taking a quick look at the body of the shade itself, needless to say it appears a bit expired. But in order to get to the bottom of this, we do have to delve quite a bit into speculation territory. When we take a look at these roots and the souls contained within them, we can see the roots growing in through and around them, to the point where a body placed here physically becomes another root, which leads me to the idea that the whole scene in the chest of the shade may actually be paths in which roots had grown. But if that would be the case, it would mean that a crab not only separated one of these from the roots, but also used it as a new body for itself. But then that also begs the question of where did the crab come from? And even if this idea that we stated
Yeah, the crab got me. I was muted for all of that. Damn it. Oh, no. All right, so what I was saying was, yeah, I definitely don't necessarily agree with the idea that these things came from the roots directly. And then I went off on a whole tangent on how I believed the cemetery shades losing their hearts and or potentially like their lungs is probably supposed to be relevant and it could play into why they're able to be taken over by the crabs because blood is kind of a really big deal in the lands between, and with the heart pumping blood and hearts being used for like dragon communion and consuming hearts, it kind of turns people more draconic because they consume the gold. I wonder whether or not the lack of a heart allows a person's body to be more readily controlled by outside influences like the crabs themselves. And so, well, I don't necessarily think that they came like from the roots like Zeostorm is saying. I can't necessarily disprove it either. It just, doesn't necessarily fit my headcanon. So I respect him establishing that this is the territory of speculation before going into it. Thought something happened with the dog again. Yeah, he's been doing all right. We've got him on medication. He's curled up. Like, the way that he likes to lie down and sleep sometimes, like, he just kind of looks like a bit of a contortionist with how far back he rocks his neck and whatnot. So, yeah. I tried to, like, go to the BRB screen when that was happening, but I mean, I wasn't going to spend more time trying to, like, fix that as it happened, but I appreciate the concern very much. All right, so was there something else I said? Oh, yeah. I was also talking about its trick weapons, or maybe I talked about that earlier. Did I talk about that earlier? The trick weapon aspect of it? Maybe not. Let me know in chat if I did. If I didn't, I'll pause the video and talk about it again.
It is not true. The fact
Okay,
that the
dude, thank
crab
you.
and the body are two separate entities also begs this explanation. One of the many themes that we've been talking about in our recent lore videos is the association between death and water, with many things in the game connected to Deathroot being communicated with some aquatic imagery. But furthering a connection to this crab is the fact that crabs in Elden Ring are one of the only creatures able to be infected with death blight, with the malformed face of Godwyn growing on the back of their shells. But the actual spider crab atop the cemetery shades exhibits qualities of an insect as well with its web attack, which is also something we can see in the corpse of Godwyn and Deathroot. Looking closely at the appendages coming from the corpse, you'll notice not only that there are lots of flies buzzing around, but also that the roots themselves are sprouting insect wings. So combine all those details here, and we have a fairly solid connection. But it goes even deeper. One of the abilities of the Cemetery Shade is a short-range teleport that allows them to sort of phase out of reality and cross the room very quickly. But they're not the only ones that can do this. Ghosts, spirits, and shades can also do this phasing between realities, such as the one that's guarding the dungeon we can find the Cemetery Shade in. We also see this ability employed by the Tibia Mariners, who are said to guide those lost in death to the spirit world. It's also similar in nature to the way Ronnie, Melina, and Torrent all appear, with all of their respective associations with the spirit world. Now, the reason all of that is significant is because the emergence of spirits and the bleeding over into reality is also directly tied into the Deathroot curse and the disruption of the Order of Death. So it's not out of the realm of possibility to think that these crabs may have spawned of the corpse of Godwyn, much like is believed of the Basilisks, who share many of the same qualities with what we see on Godwyn. But the final bit of emphasis that this may be the case is the fact that the shades are particularly weak to holy damage, which is often the case for those who live in death, the undead born of Deathroot. So the theory here is that these crabs were...
I wonder if it's worth testing if the cemetery shades are super weak to Litany of Proper Death, which is kind of a weird spell because like the death birds are super weak to it, but one would not think that a death bird is among those who live in death. Anyway, I might need to test that sometime.
were born of the death root, removed a body from the Erdtree roots, and now live on it as a parasite, and commanding that body as an extension of their own. But I can admit there are a few problems with this idea. First of all, the Shades don't actually do death blight damage, which would be a dead giveaway of their connection. But the second thing is the fact that they wield weapons. Now you could chalk that up to just being more fantasy, and in a grave of warriors, I'm sure it wouldn't be too hard to find a sword. So what are some other potential explanations? Another idea that I think could be plausible is that these Shades are corrupted versions of the Grave Wardens, given that the Grave Warden duelists are some of the only characters in the game and the only humanoid characters that are specifically tasked with guarding the catacombs, but their story primarily focuses on the Colosseums and gladiatorial combat. There's a big
Yeah, I wonder how Geostorm feels about the Knight Ordovis and the Knight Siluria that guard the one hero's grave. That's the Gelmir's grave, isn't it, actually, now that I think about it? Maybe not that one. I don't really remember. So, there was something else that I wanted to talk about, maybe with the weapon. Oh, yeah. So, what I did say when I was muted before, but I kind of lost track of the second time around, was that part of the reason I don't necessarily agree with the Cemetery Shades taking the bodies from the roots is that the other bodies we do see embedded within the roots aren't kind of missing their hearts. So that doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but it's interesting to me that the Cemetery Shades are kind of noticeably different than the other bodies. Ordovis is in Oriza. Okay, that's what I thought. I thought Gelmir for a second, but I was like, wait, no, it could be Oriza. I tend to confuse a lot of the Altus Plateau catacombs in my mind for whatever reason. And I appreciate the correction there, Scaleezy. Thank you.
missing chunk between their exile from the Colosseum and their eventual role as gravekeepers, which opens up an entirely different can of worms. But personally, I just don't see enough evidence here, although I do like the idea somewhat. Fellow lore tuber Mad Luigi also has a video on the Cemetery Shades, although our conclusions tend to differ quite a bit. In that video, he raises the idea that the Cemetery Shades with their crab may have a similar origin to the pests of the Scarlet Rot, primarily due to their insect nature and use of webs, and the presence of a Cemetery Shade in Caelid. And the pests also have this crustacean theme to them, with tails like those of lobsters and a shell for a head. But when it comes to tying them to the themes of death and the Erdtree roots, I'm not sure I can make any sound conclusions in that regard. So when it comes to the Cemetery Shades, they seem to be yet another case of an enemy that's been forgotten in both the game and the lore, as we've seen time and time again. And it's not helped by the fact that these are bosses that die in 2, maybe 3 hits. When they have such a cool and interesting moveset, most players won't even see their attacks because they'll be dead before they can do any. I feel like if the Shades would have had about 5 to 10 times the health, it would have made for some very fun boss fights, especially with
Honestly, that sounds kind of terrifying just because of how aggressive they can be. It's pretty difficult to know when you're kind of safe to heal sometimes, although maybe it could be fun to have a more souped up Mantis style fight there. You only remember because you did a Crucible Knight build and you have to seriously finesse that fight to get the sword? I believe it.
with such a memorable design. I do think the Shades have a good chance of reappearing in the DLC, but like many of the things that appear below the surface of this game, we may never actually get the full explanation. But these are all the thoughts I could gather about the Cemetery Shades and the limited theory I proposed, but I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Do you believe—
So, I liked the idea that they could be the Grave Wardens, although don't really think it would probably work out for a couple reasons. One of which would be whether or not the Cemetery Shades could predate those Grave Wardens, because the Grave Wardens were a Radigan institution, so they got moved from the Colosseums and Godfrey's time into the Catacombs in Radagon's time, and there could be the possibility that the Cemetery Shades predate all of that, although we don't really have any way of verifying that whatsoever. Pretty much only those Mantis Blades talk about the Cemetery Shades, and I think there's one note, although that note might be cut content, I don't exactly remember. So there's like 2 tidbits of lore in the entire game about them, which is kind of unfortunate, because I do think they're actually like super cool enemies, and it would be cool if we had more info about them. You're still disappointed this wasn't about the Crystal Crab? So yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any other enemy that you only ever fight one of in a non-boss form. Because to be fair, the glintstone crabs, there's only 2 in the entire game, neither of which are bosses, but that's one more non-boss than the cemetery shade. One could make the argument that, like Silver Tears, there's only 2 in the game, and that's less than the number of total cemetery shades, but maybe enemy, calling it the rarest enemy means like it's not a boss, perhaps. So, yeah, I wonder if there's just another one-off of something. Moongrum? He's not, I guess he is technically an enemy. Maybe you have a point there. The Big Godwin Crab? There's a couple of those, I think. Because there's like a swamp in Altus Plateau where you're going from like the windmill area towards Gelmir. And I think, actually those ones might not be corrupted crabs. But there might be 2 big corrupted crabs. I don't know. NPCs are kind of cheating. Yeah, NPCs aren't enemies, they're NPCs. And hey, Methoda, welcome back to the stream. Trying to... What would be a rarer enemy, if any? It's a decent amount of Crucible Knights. So I wonder how many poison Albinorks there are. For any who don't know, there's like a couple poisonous style first gen Albinorks near the Albinork village, and you don't really see them anywhere else. There's also a couple of sleep crabs around there, but I don't know the exact number either. Yeah, and we talked about the Haima battle mages. So there's at least 2 of those. I don't remember exactly if there's more down in the Halec tree, but I know that there's 2 regular variants in the catacombs underneath, not catacombs, but like the mines to the west side of Radio Lucaria, like by Smaragd, and there's the other one guarding the outside of the cave to Lusat. Yeah, I wonder if there's like a random variant of an enemy that's being overlooked. But if any, I wouldn't be surprised if there's more than one. So this is kind of a hard question to consider. I always feel like it requires like a cheat sheet to look at all the enemy spawns and whatnot to figure this out. There's only a single Black Flame monk with a sword. Sort of, yes, but no. There's at least 2 in the Kayla Divine Tower, but they don't drop them. Scarlet Rot Ancestral Follower. That's a good one. But with the added caveat of if you're not playing on version 1.00. Because the underground Scarlet Rot Sanctuary with all of the Kindred of Rot in 1.0 were just ancestral shamans instead, or ancestral followers. But yeah, there is only the one of that dude way down in the Lake of Rot. So I guess 1 isn't less than 1. So maybe Zeostorm wins off a technicality, but it's not like there are 3 other boss variants of that Scarlet Rot shaman or follower or whatnot. So yeah, Drew might have the real answer there after all. So there's 2 giant Oracle boys, and that's about it. All right. Yeah, those are really good guesses there. You're still thinking the one magic buffed golem under the cliff? Oh, and Kaled? Is he alone? I know, like, he definitely stood out as being one hell of an enemy to face at a lower level and kicking my ass for hours only to get nothing for doing it. That really sucked. Yeah, he might be a one-off too. Or one-off as well.
believe there's more than meets the eye when it comes to these creatures, or are they just another monster in a fantasy world? Anyways though guys, that is going to do it for the video today. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave a like on it and subscribe if you're new around here. But with all that, I will catch you in the next one.
Oops. I'm just trying to pause it right there. So yeah, Without Horn says there's 2 magic golems with magic bows. So those are different than the golem in Caelid. I wonder if I still have footage on this hard drive. Let me look it up. So the one in Caelid has like the glaive or whatever you want to call his weapon. Okay, no, it's not on this hard drive anymore. So the one where you need to do a bunch of parkour to get down to in Caelid, over by the minor Erd tree to the east side of the map, like by the Radon arena. So that one doesn't use a bow, but yeah, there are definitely other golems that use magic, but a different form of it. Alright. So that was a good video by Zeostorm. Maybe we found an enemy he didn't consider. And I'd be fine saying the ancestral followers aren't like exactly like NPCs like Moongrum. So yeah, Drew may have come up with the actual answer. So let's go ahead and give this video a like for the content, and sub if you'd like to as well. And all that. The Mantis Blade. If you go into the fight with 0 insight, these enemies won't spawn. It's a quality comment. I'll like that. Winged Scythelord. Alright. So nobody else is coming up with a different enemy in the comments there. It might be buried. So anyway, yeah, that was a fun little video to watch. We don't really have enough time to go into another video next. So I think that'll just pretty much wrap up the stream for tonight. Just end a little bit early. Not crazy amount though. So I don't know what I want to watch tomorrow, and I did actually download Lies of P, so I'm getting ready to stream that for you guys in the very near future, most likely in a couple days. So just stay tuned for all of that stuff to get finalized. So for all of you who've joined the stream tonight, thank you so much. I appreciate that, whether you're watching live or checking out the VODs in the live section afterward. I appreciate that. We will be going live again at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so hopefully we'll see you then. Till next time, stay safe, take care. Last Protagonist out.